Arnaud, ton PDF, ton PowerPoint, il est... Ah, c'est bon, tu peux le garder pas imprimer. Qu'est-ce que tu peux l'envoyer par ou t'as un truc USB?
Non, en fait, j'ai pas internet et il y a une vidéo encastrée, donc par mail, ça va pas le faire.
Ok. Et t'as pas de dongle, d'adaptateur pour la clé?
Si.
Ouais, super. Parce qu'en fait, sinon, il y a pas mal de gens qui veulent voir sur internet.
Ah oui, d'accord.
Qui pouvaient pas venir, dont Martin.
D'accord.
Et du coup, c'est sympa si on peut, si on peut streamer.
Cross-référence déjà les discours en interview, et le doigt ça vient en plus, mais du coup ça change pas ce qui est partagé finalement. Donc on va te dire, dans la méthode, en fait, c'est de la vérification, c'est pas de la production de connaissances. Donc c'est là-dessus que tu arrives à trouver un argument genre non, bah en fait, le truc c'est clairement ouais, bon, après ça, il y a des changements avec les
C'est l'autre écran qui est... par contre, est-ce qu'on peut vérifier sur... Pas sur YouTube, et je vais faire un test de son. Moi, c'est une affiliation aussi. Ça devrait marcher.
Ouais, je pense. Là, je suis sur Keynote aussi.
Tac, t'es sur Keynote, et là, il y a quelque chose.
Ouais, j'ai jeté un autre.
Ouais, excuse-moi, on aurait tout pris, c'est le streaming, Écoute, Pasteur et Salle.
Ah, mais je comprends ce que c'est.
Ouais,
En fait, je pense que je l'enregistre.
non, mais en fait, il y a le temps qui va venir.
D'accord.
Comme c'est un peu international, du coup, maintenant, des gens dans plusieurs pays. Ouais, en live sur YouTube.
Ah oui, je pense que je vais raconter des conneries.
Ouais, ouais. One, two. Non, non. One, two. Non, pourtant. One, two. T'es sur le direct, comme ça, parce qu'il a fait à fond. Mais il met 0, 0, ça, c'est le micro. Bah, puis après, il faut regarder, mais... Ouais, mais c'est ça, c'est ça. One, two. One, two. Test. One, two. C'est bon? Tu m'entends? Celui-là? Super. Ouais, c'est trop fort. Ah oui. Mais c'est quand même compréhensible? Non? Écoute, on va passer par le micro de l'ordi sinon. Ok. Alors, je te le mets.
On peut tester la vidéo?
Ouais, bien sûr. Ah, attends.
Parce qu'il s'il va la chercher sur la clé, c'est pas mieux de le mettre sur l'ordi, tu vois ce que je veux dire?
Si, alors c'est ça la vidéo. Hein,
ouais.
Écoute, ça a l'air de marcher. Par contre, le son, ce sera sur l'ordi. Hein, je vais juste vérifier. Attends, parce que du coup, on va te mettre le micro-cravate. Ça marche ou pas? 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Matthieu, est-ce que tu me reçois? Ça marche? Ok. Pas parler trop fort dans le micro. Ok. Mais sinon, je peux descendre le truc. Enfin, je peux... attends, je vais juste descendre la tirette là. Voilà. 1, 2, 1, 2. Comme ça, c'est mieux? Est-ce que comme ça, c'est mieux? Tu me diras quand on entend... J'ai descendu, hein? pas, c'est trop grésillant. Et pourquoi celui-là il est... Mais t'es sûr que c'est pas celui-là qui capte? Ah non, c'est ses récepteurs, d'accord. Ouais. Non, mais écoute, on passe par le micro de l'ordi peut-être? Ouais, avec le micro. Si on parle là, tu m'entends? Vas-y. Alors dis-moi si t'entends.
Toi, tu as une voix qui porte, alors moi, c'est pas...
Alors vas-y, parle. Ouais.
Test. Je dois faire des tests micro, apparemment. Ça marche?
Je vais mettre au max.
D'accord.
Et il faudra que tu sois bien...
Ok, faire porter la voix.
Voilà. Ok, donc là on est bon. Alors je te remets en plein écran derrière.
Ok.
Et voilà.
Super.
David? On va y aller. Alors pardon, excuse-moi. Juste dernier réglage. Ok, alors.
Ok. Je peux y aller? J'y vais? Ça va?
On attend peut-être qu'il revienne pour que tu te présentes. Je sais pas s'ils vont peut-être te présenter.
Je sais pas. Ben, bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Arnaud Allois. Je suis anthropologue. Ok, bah j'y vais. Hein. Ouais. Ok. I made my first trip to Recife in the northeast of Brazil in 2001. The purpose of that trip was to see if the place was propitious for the PhD research in anthropology I was about to start. During the first week of my stay, I've been assaulted twice in the streets of Recife. A very good start in the field, which already appeared to me as a battlefield. So I must confess, after a few days in Recife, I was ready to leave the city and come back home to a safe place. But before giving up definitively, I decided to give Recife a last chance, and I visited a famous Mãe de Santo, a priestess of Candomblé cult, explaining to her what happened to me, as well as my fearful state of mind at that moment. She told me to come back the next day for a ritual of fechar o corpo, which literally means closing the body to bad influences. To my surprise, she invited her nephew, a young priest, younger than me, to lead the ceremony, where my body and head have been washed in a bath of fresh plants and other substances, such as red oil palm, honey, some secret powders, and so on. After the ceremony, the young priest told me, not without a smile of satisfaction, that I just went through the first step of my initiation, that I needed to complete when I would come back for a longer stay the next year. I decided to stay. I started my talk with this short description of my first steps as an initiate in the Shango cult, an Afro-Brazilian possession cult, for at least 3 reasons. The first one is because it shows how ethnography happens most of the time. It is a sequence of events which are largely out of the ethnographer's control. He's part of something bigger than him, and his intellectual project involving his mind, body, as well as, in that case, people taking care of him, and at the same time, slightly deceiving him on what is going on. The second reason for starting my talk with that episode is that I consider it as a constitutive part of my research on religious possession and the emotional learning process it involves. To say it unambiguously, the study of possession experience cannot be reduced to the study of states, states of consciousness, body states, but must be able to include the social and cultural context and practices, as well as the way people conceptualize and talk about such phenomena. The third reason is that I'm about to defend a more controversial epistemological standpoint. I would like to explore the conditions of ethnographic knowledge production with a focus on what I call full participation, meaning an unrestricted, effective, and relational commitment on the part of the ethnographer doing fieldwork. The very notion of participation raises some questions as to the objectivity of the ethnographic endeavor, as well as to the nature of the knowledge thus produced. The main goal of my presentation is to show that this knowledge, under specific conditions, is not only scientifically admissible, but also likely to shed a different kind of light on the phenomena at stake. One of the early lessons of my full participation in the Shango initiation process was that this was not a belief religion, an orthodoxy, stricto sensu, but a do religion, an orthopraxis, very much bent on following the liturgical precepts as well as a religion of experience, a phenomenopraxis to some extent, constructed on an experiential expertise in the first and third persons, as we will see. Drawing on my journey from novice to potential initiator, but also from PhD candidate to assistant professor in anthropology, I will argue in favor of the scientific validity of full participation as ethnographic method under specific conditions. To put it unequivocally, full participation is in no way a panacea for all ethnographic inquiries. I understand it as both a relational attitude towards oneself and the others, and a useful methodological toolbox for ethnographers interested in topics such as emotions, consciousness, the senses, experience, or, more broadly speaking, cultural subjectivities. My purpose is not controversial, but to encourage the development of a thicker epistemological ground in anthropology, and specifically in relation to ethnographic endeavors. I will first question the notion of objectivity in the context of ethnography. At the heart of my argument will be a discussion on the possible ethnographic reflexivity strategies of full participation, arguing that distancing oneself from first-person ethnographic knowledge should not be confused with distancing oneself from the person and affects the ethnographer is dealing with. Finally, I will stress the heuristic and epistemic added value of full participation. I will start with a quote. Objectivity, the thing, was as new as objectivity, the word, in the mid-19th century. Starting in the mid-19th century, men of science began to fret openly about a new kind of obstacle to knowledge themselves. The quote above, that comes from a beautiful book from Daston and Gallison on the history of the concept of objectivity, points unambiguously to the enemy to defeat in our way to scientific objectivity, namely the researcher's subjectivity. This objectivist view of our relation with the world has engendered at least two objectivity regimes in contemporary sciences. The first relies on falsifiability as a criterion for scientificity. In this regime of objective knowledge production, a statement is said to be falsifiable if there are facts that can prove it to be false. Falsifiability as a regime of objectivity whose aim is ostensibly to produce a universal knowledge would thus require the use of rigorous experimental methods based on the control of variables and the reproducibility of results. It is self-evident that such methodological requirements, falsifiability, control of variable, reproducibility of results, are difficult to fulfill outside an experimental setting, and even more so in the context of in situ observational research such as ethnographic studies. If so, should we give up all scientific ambitions in anthropology? Could we envisage another form of objectivity anchored in an empirical approach? ethnographic work relies on the production of abductive inferences from particular cases and ideally leads to a plausible truth and or the development of hypotheses about a specific reality. To use Passeron's words, the ethnographic method is based on, I quote him, the criterion of empirically multiplied and semantically joint exemplifications, and its efficiency can only be measured by the effects of knowledge and the effects of intelligibility that it has produced. End of quote. The key word is certainly intelligibility, meaning that the ethnographer works as a meaning mediator to a reality difficult to grasp in the absence of intimate knowledge of it, of a thick description of its protagonists, its stakes, and its social-cultural context. Intelligibility and objectivity are therefore not synonymous. Without claiming Popperian objectivity, two methodological attitudes or strategies have been used in anthropology for the purpose of attaining a form of, let's say, objective intelligibility. The first one could be called, not without irony, the stealth mode, le mode furtif, because it makes the ethnographer invisible. No longer present in its ethnographic accounts, the ethnographer embraces some fly-on-the-wall objectivity, as Fiona Bowie puts it. But we must admit that the alleged objectivity of this strategy rests on a methodological impossibility, meaning the neutralizing of the ethnographer's subjective gaze by erasing it from the account. The second and most frequently used methodological strategy today is emotional detachment, with its two distinct manifestations. One, the ethnographer creates a bonne distance, a right distance, or even a regard éloigné, a view from afar, in relation to the object in his inquiry. According to this methodological attitude, objectivity depends on maintaining an emotional distance from the people studied by the ethnographer, with whom he is nonetheless bound to share quite a few life moments. Not too close, but not too far either, in the words of Michel Agier, aptly sums up this attitude. Second, there is another kind of emotional detachment, this time aimed not at the other, but at the ethnographer himself. In other words, an objective approach requires the ethnographer to be capable of detachment, or at least of keeping his own emotion at bay. This second attitude follows the classic view of emotions as disruptive of human reason, and the need to banish them from the process of objective knowledge production, as, between others, Lévi-Strauss has defended. So what are the implications for ethnographic methods? I can think of two pitfalls to be avoided here. First, there is methodological affectivism, claiming that only the researcher subjectivism has truth value in the case of some auto-ethnographies written particularly in the American postmodernist tradition. Second, there is the persistent claim that objectivity can indeed be achieved through emotional detachment. Contemporary research on emotions bids us to better understand empathy and introspection processes and use this knowledge in anthropological work. One way to do that, as we will see, is the ethnographers developing a unique degree of empathic resonance and introspective expertise, which derive the ethnographic validity mostly from the ethnographer's reflexivity during and after fieldwork. What I'm suggesting here is a methodological alternative based on full participation and requiring from the ethnographer not so much to create an objectifying distance from his hosts and his own emotions, but rather from ethnographic knowledge itself. That means the knowledge produced and rendered by the ethnographer in the first person. I choose to go straight to the point and begin with a short video of my pre-possession experience and a short introspective account of my possession episode that happened in summer 2014. because both illustrates unequivocally what I understand by full participation and serves as a case in point supporting my discussion of the specific condition that grant ethnographic admissibility to full participation. So, firstly, a nice photo of me. I thought about giving it to ALIUS, but they told me they wanted a serious picture, so I didn't. This was I know. Where is the souris? Ah, she's here. It's here. Okay. Okay, I don't have it. This is not this. This is Junior. This is me doing a ritual of fechar o corpo. You see, he has an authoritative attitude towards my divinity, my deity, calling it come and possess me. He's a female initiator. Most of the time it's a couple, a man and a woman. And the man is the pi descent is quite authoritative, and the mother is very maternal. And they work together. Like you have the authority and you have the caring. See the gesture of capture. It's trying to catch the divinity. It won't happen. Amen. Okay. Now, you have here the description from inside. I tried to put this experience in 2 words. This is a part of it because it's much longer, but well, it's quite a condensation of what I try to express, saying that something comes into me, a force invades my body from the spine, it transits from the bottom to the top, forcing my leg to stretch. The odemata, you know, the iron bow and arrow, is in contact with my head. Ode, my orisha, is present. It comes close to me, however, I remain conscious all the time. I then decide to let the force flow, to let myself go to this new sensation. I remember the first signs were a sudden acceleration of my heart, beating up in my torso, as well as an intensifying of my breathing. I remember at the moment Junior talking to me about the terrible sensation he associated with this loss of control. In my case, I found it quite pleasurable because it is a sensation of strength I had never felt before with such intensity. I then told myself the orisha is a secret for oneself, an intimate secret lodged in the deep of your flesh, impenetrable. Images were going through my mind, images of irradiated person I had seen during the preceding months of my research, the body trembling as mine at that moment. I could feel in my own body what this person was feeling, leading some of them to laugh or cry, the body in vibration, a nuclear chill, a terrible shiver, and so on. This is my field notes. Now I will read a short episode that happened 11 years later. This is, people call this kind of episode irradiation. It means the preceding step before actual possession. And now I will describe from inside an actual possession that happened to me some 11 years. I had the total of 3 episodes of possession, and this is the 3rd, the last one. This is my field notes. This is it, it's done. This is it, I did it. I passed the test of the Deka, the initiatic ceremony for becoming an elder or a potential initiator in the Shango cult. Junior, my young initiator, surprised me when he called Ode, my orisha, or African deity, right there in the middle of the salon, the place of public ceremonies. But then Ode answered him right away. I felt a veil coming down in my consciousness, on my consciousness. Then the sudden rise of that force that I have felt before, which erases the line separating the animal from the empress. References to the Tarot de Marseille. Bon, it's another story. Separating the force that keeps the mouth open from the one that pulls out of it. Contrary to many accounts by possessed people that I have collected myself, and the traditional established idiom of possession, I did not switch off, apagar. For me, it is more like being roped in a dreamlike state, having a veil over my consciousness that transforms the outer world into a sort of lucid dream in which I see myself doing things, a sort of Lyrician lived theater where Ode and I are perceived as being one by both the others and myself. I have many visual and sound flash memories, but all of them feel like they are contained by some other body than mine, a body that pulsates from inside, a body for which feeling and acting are one, dancing is perceiving the world, feeling it, experiencing it, an imperative force very much like a heartbeat of the whole body. Okay. So, what is the epistemological value of data provided by the ethnographer, introspective account of his own experience? I will put forward 2 hypotheses that will sound counterintuitive to ethnographic common sense. The first is that they are not more trustworthy because they come from the ethnographer, and therefore are allegedly closer to an objective account, using the objectifying strategies described earlier. An account is what it is, the translation of a subjective relation with the world. The second is that the data are not less trustworthy because they come from someone outside the studied culture, since the lived experience of the ethnographer was validated by the members of the culture, in that case the Shango religious experts. In some, while they cannot be waved off, they cannot be taken at face value either. Their value for the anthropological endeavor remains ambiguous. How can one make the best of them? What are the conditions for processing introspective data as genuine ethnographic knowledge? My answer, with the help of 3 forms of ethnographic reflexivity. So, the first one is, I'll keep it to inspire you, the self in the third person. The first form of reflexivity, which David already talked about, is the shift from the self in the first person to the self in the third person. Moving off center, taking one's distance, is not the same as emotional detachment, as described earlier. On the contrary, as Jean Favre-Sada has aptly shown on a study in witchcraft in the Bocage, this shift requires the ethnographer should first allow himself to be caught, la prise. He is, or allow himself to be affected by affective intensities that he dutifully records in his field notes every day. The practice of empathic resonance and introspective thinking will provide the basis for being caught a second time, la reprise, with the advantage of distance in both space and time from the field. The distance becomes part of the research temporality, meaning that the ethnographers will be able to come back to the description of his own experience and approach it as one among many others, this time detached from the emotions that gave rise to it in the first place. And such exercise might rely on the ethnographer's developing of some technologies of the self, quoting Foucault, both as the researcher who feels and understands the emotions that stir him, and as the writer who puts them into words. As Daston and Gallison rightly remind us, I quote them, the mastery of scientific practice is inevitably linked to self-mastery, the assiduous cultivation of a certain kind of self, end of quote. Writing is thus critical to the process of creating distance, being involved in each of its stages. During the being caught phase, writing records not only the contours of the lived experience, but also makes distancing possible for the first time. During the being caught again phase, these field notes become the raw material for analyzing the ethnographer's own experience during fieldwork. As we will see, the description of the ethnographer's own experience will complement other field notes and provide the necessary ethnographic material for a comparative analysis. But it might also reveal avenues of research that might have been overlooked in the other categories of collected data. A second form of ethnographic reflexivity is to make note of the ethnographer's experience as perceived by his hosts. This is what I call the self in the second person, since the ethnographer learns how to get to know and interpret his own experiences through the eyes of the others. In this case, the very other that he's trying to understand. My own training in possession has relied mostly on the reactions of religious experts to my own experiences, as I gradually found out what possession meant, bodily speaking. When cultural experts, in this case religious experts, identify the ethnographer's experience, it does not mean that they identify it with their own. At the most, they acknowledge it as a legitimate, not fake, experience of possession, shared by an entire category of individuals, namely the possessed and the candidates to possession. The content or qualia of the experience is by definition idiosyncratic and cannot thus be mistaken for the process of the experience, which in many cases is based on perceptual inferences by a priest or priestess about one body state made in a given setting and based on the manifestation of observable psychophysiological effects, like, for example, a strong shiver or goosebumps and so on. The second form of ethnographic reflexivity requires a commitment to an epistemic reciprocity between the ethnographer and his hosts, reciprocity which in turn requires that the ethnographer parts from the scientific quant à soi, typical of all seeing eye attitude. As opposed to being caught and being caught again, the self in the second person type of ethnographic reflexivity is more contingent because it does not depend directly on the ethnographer. Its felicity conditions rely both on the ethnographer's need to fill a position in the social system and on the willingness to allow himself to be touched or caught by the affects that come with that position. The stake for the ethnographer is not so much pretend play or make-believe as it is to fully accept the affective implication of the place assigned to him. Only second-person reflexivity makes it possible to acknowledge ethnographically the sharing of dispositions and not of the sameness of experience, as I have already said. So the sharing of disposition by the ethnographer and his hosts. The dispositions to be acknowledged concern the capacity to share an experience when and how it is expected. From this perspective, the production of anthropological knowledge arises rather than from a pragmatics of action than an hermeneutics of otherness. Rather than rely on a we and their metaphysics, so popular in the more philosophical circles of the anthropological discipline, I find it more fruitful to put back the ethnographic encounter at the heart of the anthropological endeavor by studying in situ the conditions of mutual misunderstanding. And so, the third kind of reflexivity, certainly more familiar to field anthropologists, is to cross-check the ethnographic data gathered in order to determine what constitute shared traits and what constitute the unique individual and cultural traits of the experience, or better, of the experiences. The ethnographic data can come from at least 3 different sources: participation, observation, and interviews with the people. These sources can be seen as separate moments of the ethnographic project, or they can feed into each other. Each of these sources of ethnographic data has its advantages and limitations that I won't go through today. To conclude, I will conclude with some reflection about the added value of full participation and ethnographic reflexivity as an added value for ethnography and the study of consciousness diversity. The question is worth asking given the affective costs and its relational consequences to the ethnographer at the time of being caught, as well as the epistemological discomfort of being caught in a second time when it comes back to his ethnographic data. I believe that full participation does present 2 advantages or noteworthy functions. On the one hand, full participation guides the gaze of the ethnographer. It teaches him where and how to look. Education of attention, as Tim Ingalls coined it, is critically important in a religious culture such as the Shango, where knowledge is implicitly taken rather than explicitly given. A learning process that Matthieu Koroma nicely calls katarpholias, meaning to pick up information here and there patiently with the hope that at some point a synthesis will be possible. This is the heuristic function of full participation. In my research on religious learning in the Shango cult, my journey as initiated and possessed in training guided my attention toward the sensory and affective dimensions of religious learning, and in particular to the constitutive role of liturgical activity in the development of possession-specific emotional expertise. And here are some authors and concepts that I've been developing for almost 10 years but I won't go into details here. I've been trying to identify and describe as precisely as possible the kind of uncanny feelings the people were describing to me when they talked about depossession. And also I explore the actual emotional learning process at work in possession experience. In ritual contexts, but also in the experience of the possessed and in the experience of the possessed seen by the religious experts. Investigating the cognitive appraisal, the bodily expression, the subjective feelings. Unfortunately, as an anthropologist, using some kind of, let's say, traditional methods, I didn't have access to physiological arousal or brain patterns, but some new anthropologists today are investigating this fifth dimension with experimental settings in the field. And what I've been very interested in too is the kind of affective and enculturation, enculturation that I've been observing in the Shango cult. A process quite similar to what David has been describing earlier. On the other hand, full participation also fulfills an epistemic function by creating the condition for the ethnographer's developing of dispositions and abilities to do things, to experience or to be in the world differently. In short, this is the first step in the direction of exercising judgment and having a cultural expertise in sync with that of the people studied by the ethnographer. The aim of the ethnographer who uses full participation as a methodology is not to go native or to pretend to have gone native, but rather to cultivate a form of openness to the affective intensities of the other culture, an empathic ability, as well as a form of self-observation in paying attention to the effect they have on him, an introspective ability. While, as I shown earlier, full participation demands the establishing of an ethnographic reflexivity of experience, it also relies on a series of technologies of the self, or technologies of body awareness, that the ethnographer is encouraged to learn so that it can become what Stephen Gould calls a more sensitive introspective instrument. The epistemic function of full participation is certainly more debatable, but also the one to offer, let's say, maybe disruptive epistemological perspectives, particularly as it questions the conditions of scientific knowledge production. Even if it would be a mistake to reduce the background of our experimental colleagues to the scientific culture to which they belong, we must admit that the ethnographer's position is alien and sometimes disruptive insofar as the very situation of data production is a source of constant questioning, if not challenging, of the soundness of his approach as legitimate knowledge about the world. In sum, it is precisely because the ethnographer is in direct contact with cultural diversity and the plurality of frames of reference that reflexivity must be an integral part of his method. Thank you.
Thank you, Arno, for this talk. Actually, you convinced me a long time ago of the usefulness of full participation in the study of initiation and possession rituals. So I'm left with two stupid questions. And the first one is really stupid. It's what about shy anthropologists? Both lack empathy and introspective ability. I told you it's a very stupid question. And my second, slightly less stupid question is you insist on the epistemic symmetry with your initiative father by the, I don't know exactly, the name. And so in these terms of symmetries, of epistemological status of knowledge, Are there any consequences on the publication of your results in terms, for instance, of co-authorship or things like that?
Yeah, maybe I will start with the second one. Most of the time, I had at least two hats: the Arnaud the initiate and Arnaud the anthropologist who was writing a book.
Okay, so you're already two people signing your book.
Yeah.
In a way.
And my deity, of course. But every time I was in a delicate situation in relation to knowledge divulgation, the religious expert came to me and said, "Oh, today, Arnaud, you can take some notes, only for you. You cannot record," for example. Or the next time they told me, you cannot take notes and you cannot record. It's just for you. You don't put this in your book." And so all the time I was playing with this kind of situation, and sometimes negotiating. When I needed the information, I tried as far as I could to negotiate the authorization to put it in my book. But most of the time it was not necessary.
And anyway, when it comes from yourself, actually you don't need this kind of authorization.
No.
Except of yourself as an initiated.
Yeah.
Do you give yourself the authorization?
Most of the time, yes. Most of the time, yes. Yes, I have a sad story because my brother, he's a filmmaker, and he came back and he came to the field. He stayed there. I stayed there for my long field, 14 months. It's too long. Don't do that. My young Ronnie said, "Don't do that. Go 6 months, come back home." And 3 months later, because I was overwhelmed with affective stuff and data when I came back, and he stayed there 6 months, filming all my initiatic process. And when he came back home, and at every step, they had to ask the spirits, the deity, if they agreed of filming. And they always agreed. And like the priests were like swelling, and they didn't understand, how is that possible that Gringo will film the things nobody have never seen? And so he did that. We were sure we will have a fantastic film to show. And a week after he came back in Brussels, his apartment burnt. He lost everything. Well, the film you have seen, it's the 25 minutes we saved because it's the 25 minutes we were about to show to a producer to have the money to make the film. And so I've never filmed from that date. And of course when when I told that to my fellows in Brazil, they thought that it's quite obvious. I think the auditor changed their mind. Yeah. So about shy anthropologists, well, do another fieldwork, do something more. But it's easy. It's quite hard to enter, but when you are inside, you are at home. And it's favelas, so you're protected by the community. I've been racketé, how do you say that, racketed? Comment? Jumped many times during the first weeks in my fieldwork because I was a stranger. But after that, never more. After they knew that I was a new initiate of the priest in the temple. So, yes. Thank you for your questions.
You also like when it's about like the efficacy of that methodology, like on the study of initiative process. But I wanted to know, because I know that we are always like inviting to talk about the stuff, but I know that now you're working about other stuff. And so I wanted to know about your point of view on that, the application of that methodology on other objects. Because it's quite obvious that for my case or for your case, like when you're working about like social learning, or cultural or religious learning, being participating to the learning process, clearly it's giving you great position to observe and to learn. But
And
what is
it-
it about
yes.
like the extension of the pertinence of that methodology to other objects?
As I said at the beginning, I think it's quite precious when you are investigating cultural subjectivities in general, and because it puts you in a situation, in a social situation, like Jean-François Sada said, people always attribute a position to you, and so from that position you can say things about that culture you are participating, because your position will change with time. And this is why long-term ethnography is important, because your position will change. Might change from the novice to the elder to the potential initiator. And this has priors, to use a term you like, quite different from what people are expecting you to live as possessed, as an initiator, as a novice. And so this is why ethnography, well, I defend my church, of course, but this is why ethnography is so important in my view, because maybe it's the unique opportunity to have that position in that culture at that time. And this, you cannot replace that. And this is why I started with how I came to be initiated, because this has a huge impact of all my research, because I was given that position. I didn't have any choice. If I wanted to go on in that cult, I had to go on as a candidate to initiation.
But for instance, in your new field,
In my new field, it's quite different. I'm working on skin disease called psoriasis.
Okay, that's a full participation.
so you need psoriasis.
So it's not full participation, but it seems it's quite a personal subject. But there are many psoriasis in my family, and so yes, it's a huge motivation to understand better this disease. And well, I'm interested about experiential knowledge of people with chronic disease, and so I'm not so far away from what I was doing. There, I was interested about how rituals such as candomblé change people in the way they feel, in the way they pay attention to things, in the way they relate to each other. And now I'm studying how a chronic disease changes people, in the way they feel, in the way they relate to their thoughts, to their feelings, to their relatives, and so on. So it's more difficult to make full participation in the way that there is no rituals, and so there is no this kind of concentration of stuff happening. I think I will maybe follow some patients going to the physician and this kind of stuff, but it's mainly about interviewing and trying to use also elicitation interviews to know better what people do to go better, because it's quite difficult to use elicitation for suffering, you know. And when you suffer, what you feel, you know, it's quite ethically difficult for me to go further in that way. Yes?
Can I ask, what is your personal interpretation of the metaphysics of possession? Did you arrive with a particular set of prior beliefs of the metaphysics, and did that change after your experience?
Yeah. Thank you. This is the first question my students ask me. But they ask more explicitly, you believe in that? I think it's not necessary. I'm a stupid materialist. I think deeply stupid. But it works for me, you know? And people just don't care in candomblé about what you believe in, and then will never ask you what you believe. Because they are pragmatists, and because it's a religion of experience. And some people have sensibility to this kind of rituals, others no, and most people will become more and more sensible to it participating in it. And so I saw a person, she was 72, she was initiated when she was young, and it was the first time she was possessed. She waited a long time. And I saw a young daughter, she was 6.5. It was fantastic. Her possession was fantastic. So it's always the same problem, not problem, but this is a two-faced coin. Like, you know, you have some, let's say, natural, in two brackets, natural sensibility, and you have practices and a culture which will work it out and make you more sensible or less sensible to certain kind of things. Yeah.
Thanks, Arnaud, for your presentation. It was really, really interesting. I have a question. What will be the difference between participation and full participation?
Yeah. In that kind, you know, at what time of the field you say, not you, like Jean-François Sada also said it, you're not giving up the intellectual project, but you're not all the time saying to yourself, I must keep a distance, because this is what is taught to you when you are a student in anthropology. You have to keep a distance, because if you do not, it will not be objective. And I saw it's really wrong, because objectivity is not to keep a distance from the others or from emotions, but to develop a kind of reflexivity in the case of ethnography. And so full participation is you go, you know. You don't calculate anymore.
So it's like letting go.
Yeah, you let go. You live it fully. But there is, for me, the bigger difference between my experience of possession and there, if there is one, is that all the time I was still telling to myself, don't forget about it, because you have to write it down. And
You mean when this was happening?
yes, yes. And sometimes it was quite difficult. But this changes fundamentally the experience.
So it was not full?
It was almost full.
No, I'm just asking this question because my field work was meditation.
Ah, yes.
And I was also practitioner.
Yeah.
I was observing, but a practitioner, when everybody is silent and focus on the breathing, you try to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
Also
No, it should be.
Really try that out, but
Maybe we can imagine a methodology with two anthropologists. One that lives it, and the other that comes after and do elicitation interview with him all the time. So he can live it fully, and after he will have a comparse who will help him to put words of what he has been living. For example, we can imagine a lot of things.
so the full participation will be more state of mind.
Yes, it's a state of mind, yeah. And it's also about technology of the self. I teach that to my students. I try to teach that you have to learn to pay attention to what's happening to you, because it will help you when you will have to put words to describe the experience you've been through. And so do meditation, do Tai Chi, do Qigong, this kind of stuff. Do sport.
That's what we said in Orléans with Benoît Grison.
Ah, yeah.
You know him.
Yes, I know him, yeah.
It's our last question.
I'm just curious. Do you think the intention to remember, do you think that's the reason why you didn't go fully out and retain the observer kind of awareness?
The will, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think that's the underlying reason, or do you think some other reasons?
What I think today is that there is a very strong social prescription that you cannot remember what happened during possession. But today I believe that most people living possession remember something. But telling it to the community may impair the legitimation process of what they've been through. And this would be a second kind of amnesia. You know, there is a real amnesia. There is this kind of social amnesia, and the third one. A person told me that I thought it very nice. Possession é segredo para si. It's a secret for oneself. Meaning, the people living possession doesn't want to talk about it, doesn't want to share it, because doing it, it will pervert it. Yeah.
Do you remember something without telling me what it is?
Yeah, I wrote it down.
No, but
Yeah.
it's in the
Yes, I have many self-reports of people. Yeah.
Because I thought earlier you said most of them go out.
No, I have many self-reports of irradiation, the first step of possession. I don't have any of the full manifestation when people are dancing through, you know. Yeah, but I have some reports. Yeah. Thank you.
We'll have like a 5-10 minute break and then follow up with tout l'instant proposé.
Choper sur la screen à côté, c'est ça
Alors, c'est l'ordinateur, oui. Pardon, quoi que tu l'as déjà, toi, non? Tu l'avais déjà mis? Ah, pardon, excuse-moi. Ah, d'accord. Il faut que tu le mettes là, voilà.
Merci.
Dans les bouteilles en métal, tu veux dire?
Ouais. Il y en avait tout à l'heure, et comme ça. Pas s'électrocuter. Ben là.
Ah, voilà.
Yes.
If you but how you attribute
different connections between symptoms? That's a question in itself. Like, to what extent, I don't know, your, for instance, I have tinnitus. To what extent my symptoms just connect to compared to another. And that's something super hard. It's very subjective.
Well, you can assess anxiety.
Yes. But what I mean is like maybe the strength of anxiety or the strength of tinnitus in one person will be very different from another. And since it's both symptoms that are subjective, it's hard to probe. But it's very tricky and important. This question is very important.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Or at the same, like I think a similar question would be for him. Okay, maybe the cultural enculturation is very important for hallucinations, but how? What exactly? Like which aspects of cultural?
Yeah. Well, a way would be to have. Once you have the network connectivity between symptoms on every population, maybe knowing the value of the tumors and projecting it back on the edge, that is an average. For instance, on average, you detect that there is sexual lesions that you study in claims of the eye has very high possibility of the these networks are not the same when you are first person or third person. That's already a first, yeah, that's already a first iteration. But then what the friend of Jean we are working with was saying is that as the data also from other medicine, so other MDs, so we can actually not quantify the correlation between symptoms for one MD or for every MD in general, but we can also quantify the variability of how much the connection of the two symptoms are variable across the can also do that it's complicated the same person where you ask the same question. The same person maybe on
that they would have a method to
not to call qualitatively the strength of all the things, but then in the end require to formalize it in a quantitative way to have a graph.
Ça me plaît d'avoir ça derrière.
Tu t'es retrouvé ici, toi?
Parce que, je sais pas, plein d'amis en commun, mais j'étais à Durham le mois dernier pour un congrès super cool sur voice hearing. C'était là où j'ai rencontré David, on avait des amis en commun, on était sur des projets en commun. Et puis, on avait besoin d'un autre entrepreneur de service qui sont donc David m'a invité.
Que ça coupe pas les rues. C'était très bon, donc
Ouais, c'est ça.
Et du coup, tu vas rester un petit peu?
Non, je peux pas.
Ok. Tu contribues à ton enfant de carrière sympathiquement. Tu te fais de bonnes années.
Voilà. En ce moment, j'assure pas. En Europe tous les mois, pour 4 jours. Bah oui, ouais, comme tu veux.
Okay, guys, we listen now at Samuel.
Est-ce qu'il y a moyen de voir mes slides?
Raph?
T'as un souci, non?
Il y a moyen de voir mes slides ou comment tu fais l'agrandissage par exemple?
Ah non, alors faut... Attends, on va te mettre en...
Sinon, si je le vends, si ça va comme...
Ça va comme ça?
Bah, je préfère un peu plus grande parce que...
Alors, on va voir si on peut.
Si on peut pas, bah...
Je
fais
vais
mon petit.
Sur un display. Mirror display. Voilà. Et là... Ah non, par contre, je vais juste vérifier que ça reprend juste bien. Ouais, là, du coup, ça fout un peu de tout. J'ai l'impression. Attends, je vais juste voir ce que ça donne sur le stream parce que.
Ouais.
Sinon, on va repasser.
Surtout, je ferais que voir les équations derrière. Ouais. Un vrai scientifique, sérieux. Ouais. À l'école normale supérieure à la Non, c'est parce que j'ai honte de ma calvitie en fait. J'ai un gros complexe.
Et là, t'es bon.
Je suis bon?
Ouais.
Bonjour à toutes. Hi, it's an honor and pleasure to be here. Thank you. So I'm Samuel Vessier. I'm an assistant professor of psychiatry at McGill University. I'm a co-director of a Culture, Mind and Brain program. By training, I was or used to be an anthropologist, and I think in many ways I'm going to be making a case for something quite a bit different from the two previous talks, and I'm going to be making a case for a more sort of objective, third personal take on culture. So my talk is probably going to be quite incoherent. I'm very sleep deprived. I just arrived from Vancouver. So I'll either be just really slurred in my speech or really hypomanic and talking too fast, so I apologize in advance. So I probably won't get to even a third of my slides, but I want to introduce you all to what my colleagues and I think is a pretty exciting research agenda around cultural affordances, and the aims of which are to I guess, operationalize the elusive notion of culture, to perhaps even see if there are ways to reverse engineer some kind of a mechanism that might enable us to describe and study culture. So I invite you all to maybe remain agnostic at this point about where this mechanism might be. I'm sometimes tempted to call it a psychological mechanism, but I don't know what the mind is, I don't know where it is, but the point is to describe mechanistically a little bit of what culture is. So before telling you a bit more about my agenda for this talk and for well, what I'll be talking about, I can maybe take you a little bit through how I came to be interested in elucidating general mechanisms of culture by way of reverse engineering. So about 5 or 6 years after my PhD, I had been trained in North America in the early 2000s in very postmodern American anthropology. I have written many narcissistic, cringeworthy American-style autoethnographies. And something happened gradually, but perhaps it's after I took ayahuasca in Marajó Island in Brazil, where I became increasingly frustrated with my inability to explain to, say, my grandmother, my children, my students, or even myself, what exactly I meant by culture. So my first project, after I began reconverting as a cognitive anthropologist, so I quit my job I was teaching between Northeast Brazil and Northern Manitoba in Canada. Went back to McGill to retrain in cognitive science, so I started retraining in lots of things, neuroscience, hypnosis, the philosophy of mind. And my first project was studying a really strange culture of young people who conjure non-pathological voices. So they're called tulpamancers, and they borrow some vague idea of Buddhism, and they conjure imaginary friends that they claim are sentient beings, and they experience them very much as full-fledged auditory hallucinations, except that it feels really good to them. So I published a couple of papers on that, and whenever I present my work, people are very curious. They want me to talk about tulpamancers. But I, for one, never really want to talk about tulpamancy because I find it quite banal, quite vanilla. Vanilla en anglais, ça veut dire c'est bateau, c'est papa, maman, c'est pas très intéressant. So there's lots of slightly more interesting things about tulpamancy. So first, but these are I still consider to be somewhat shallow takes on it as well. You know, the fact that there's a community of people who hear voices, for whom it feels good and it seems to be meaningful, well, that can help us rethink simplistic notions about mental illness, about psychopathology. For me, it's much more interesting to think of the role of cultural context, whatever that may be, in eliciting and inviting certain kinds of experiences and in assigning valence, goodness or badness, to certain kinds of experiences. So, in other words, for me, tulpamancy, it illuminates basically fundamental mechanisms to help us understand what we might mean by culture or cognition or consciousness or even the self. So another sort of brief parenthesis before, I liked how David this morning borrowed Tanya Lerman's notion of cultural invitations, and we heard that in Arnaud's talk as well. And at the end of Arnaud's talk, I was struck with the question again of what are the conditions under which people might have experiences that they're then likely to call possession? What are the conditions under which these sorts of experiences are possible? So it seemed to me, well, if we examine someone who volitionally is motivationally invested in having these experiences, they enter a candomblé practice, so they can sort of confabulate in those ways. That's easy. But what about experiences where people are involuntarily recruited into those experiences? So one sort of late example in my career as a cultural anthropologist that got me to reflect on that was actually visiting a Paiji Santo. So this is a sort of a candomblé master in Belém do Pará in northeast Brazil with my son, who was then 3 years old. And my son is, you know, something of a hyperactive child, badly behaved, you know, sort of annoying child. And so when we entered the candomblé terreau, and my son knew absolutely nothing about these practices, there were no rituals taking place at the moment, he started just turning and twirling around like a devil, like it's as though he was possessed. It was really strange. He just walked in there, and I guess he picks up on a sort of an implicit system of shared expectations where somehow his body practice is shaped in this particular way. And then the Paiji Santo said, yeah, ele está manifestando, you know, there's a spirit there. So I got sort of a little scared and a little annoyed because I'm a vulgar materialist, so I just took my son away and I decided not to use that system of meaning. Now you can imagine how the same child in a different context might be invited to attach a label that you might call, I don't know, ADHD to his experience, and then it would become meaningful and predictable and patterned in different ways. So it's this sort of implicit patterning of behavior and attention that really interests me here. And that my colleagues and I attempt to elucidate through this model we call cultural affordances. So that was our first paper. So with Lawrence Kmeyer, cultural psychiatrist, Maxwell Ramstead, a philosopher. So yeah, and this is hopefully going to be our magnum opus. We have now been joined in the endeavor by none other than His Majesty Carl Friston. And the paper was accepted for review in Behavioral and Brain Sciences for a target piece, and we're going through the second round of review. So this is where we're hoping to publish our manifesto. So we've also looked at niche construction from this sort of perspective, the phenomenology of psychiatric disorder, and I also work quite a bit these days. That's the one thing that actually pays my bills on hypersociality in smartphone addiction, also from a cultural affordance perspective. And then another series of projects that I wish I had time to talk to you about. We also work in, I guess you could call it placebo therapeutics, but from my perspective, what we try to do is basically manipulate contextual, ecological, and cultural cues to produce automatic experiences of healing. So in different experiments, we use in particular the shamanic power, the high epistemic authority of neuroscience and neuroenchantment, so the trust that people place in neurotechnology and brain-based explanatory models, and we're able to, well, quite easily induce really strange experiences. So, so this is a deactivated scanner in which, after undergoing humiliating waiting rituals and so forth, we invite participants with different kinds of problems to enter the machine, and we tell them, you will notice the machine will help your brain heal itself. We give them specific suggestions about whatever it is that they have difficulties with. And this is, for example, a young girl with a chronic skin condition from skin picking. Nothing had worked. And after 2 sessions, lo and behold, it healed. So I wanted to begin by giving you these disparate kinds of examples to help us think about ways to reverse engineer those mechanisms that we might call culture, and also as a way to exercise a little bit of caution about the enthusiasm of granting so much authority to first personal perspectives when, certainly from a cognitive scientific perspective, the idea that people are expert over their own lives and their own experiences and that people understand why they do what they do is perhaps a little naive. So here you have an example of certainly paternalistic, but perhaps benevolent project in which when we understand predictably the way in which people respond to ritual and symbolic cues, then we can really target and affect parts of their experience that is typically outside of volitional control. So parasympathetic nervous system kinds of responses. So I'm done with my weird examples. I'm now going to take you a little more didactically through first, well, the puzzle of culture. Like what is it exactly that we're talking about? I'll talk a bit more about cultural affordances. If I have time, I'll talk about invariant structural recipes for how humans are always responding to cultural affordances and try to identify some pattern variability, so intergroup, intragroup, individual, affective, temporal. There's lots of patterned ways in which we tend to automatically and predictably respond to context. And if I have time, I'll share a few interesting methodologies from cognitive anthropology to study people's implicit expectation. So I'm going to keep talking really fast and hypomanically. Had I the time, I would engage in a sort of dialogical, so guys, where do you think culture is? And then would write down a few things, and then I would proceed to show you that you're wrong. So I'm not going to do that. But when I ask a class of people or a class of experts in different disciplines, usually people mention obvious sort of environmental factors, demographic variables. I think in most of neuroscience, public health, the medical sciences, cognitive psychology, we try to add a few kind of demographic variables, gender, sex, ethnicity, religion, etc., to account for culture. These are the sort of obvious. Some people sometimes mention less obvious, and note how we're already venturing into a kind of weird metaphysics here, social norms, cultural values, beliefs, but what the hell are these, right? So of course, in a I think kind of a classical anthropological tradition like that of Pierre Bourdieu, what interests me here is the doxastic, the doxa, everything that is taken for granted, that is implicit, that is invisible in any given society. Yeah, and so perhaps we might think of culture as a syndrome. A syndrome is a sort of a constellation of symptoms that co-occur in particular ways, the correlation of which is difficult to ascertain, but when we know that these symptoms co-occur together, we can say, oh, there's this syndrome, so there's fibromyalgia, or there's multiple sclerosis. So culture, indeed, the self, is a weird kind of bundle of symptoms, bundles of bodily symptoms that co-occur in strange ways, and our work is to attempt to elucidate that. Again, reminding ourselves just how mysterious it all is. So this is a quote from Keith Hart, the Cambridge anthropologist. just poetically telling us just how mysterious. We invoke this idea of society because we live in it and it lives inside us, but not at a level that is typically visible. So yeah, Alan Young, one of my mentors at McGill, a great scholar of the social construction of post-traumatic disorder. So from Alan Young's perspective, first you have a diagnostic construct, and then a set of sort of epidemic beliefs about what constitutes an experience, and then people sort of recruit themselves implicitly and explicitly into this construct, and then you have something like post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's a sort of a dynamic nominalist account of psychopathology or of culture. So Alan Young likes to say, well, culture is all that is taken for granted. But again, sure, that's interesting, that's kind of sexy, but if I were to explain that to my grandmother, she would be sort of baffled. Is there a way in which we can perhaps be a little more precise? So our answer, which is really kind of deceptively obvious, but it's strange to me that few people think of it as culture is, well, it's other minds. It's something to do with other people, for sure, but minds in particular, and I'm going to get there in a minute. And so this is an old story found everywhere. Arthur Rimbaud tells us, I is another, je est un autre. From another ethical perspective, Jean-Paul Sartre tells us, l'enfer c'est les autres. Then you have le bienveillant Abbé Pierre, who tells us, no, no, it's the other way around. Without other people, then, well, you can't be human if you're cut off from others. And now I think we're getting a lot more scientifically precise. If I were to give like a Twitter version, like a 1-minute version of everything that I attempt to work on, I would say that it is quite well captured in this modern haiku by the poetess Mayuzumi Madoka, who tells us about a really, really beautiful moment in the genealogy of a love story. So there you have a young woman choosing a swimsuit and asking herself, when did I start seeing through his eyes? So just pause for a second to really wonder at just this amazing cognitive embodied projected operation of you learn to see yourself outside of your own body through the eyes and the body and the feelings of another person. And this, it seems to me, is just the essence and the mystery, the beauty of what it is like to be human. And as I'm going to go on to try to argue, human consciousness is always, through and through, saturated with other minds and with this very process here of learning to think not just about, but through other minds, to think and feel through other people. So now I go back to tulpomancy, people who create these automated hallucinatory voices. Why is tulpomancy banal? For me, because cognition is always already tulpa-like. So we probably have, all of us, our mental lives are saturated with all kinds of mental characters, all kinds of proto-tulpas, some of them generalized from our idea of our, I don't know, our in-group, some of them specific. So say when you have you experience a moment thinking, oh, what would mother think of me right now? Or what would my lover think of this particular shirt? Then you're engaging with a kind of a prototulpa, semi-automated mental model that sort of pops up in your consciousness and that makes you feel like something and indeed derive meaning and value to your own experience through this process of thinking through other minds. So I'll try to switch a little bit, but the ambitious interdisciplinary conversation that we try to facilitate, I guess first in the philosophies of mind reconciles the analytic and the continental traditions. So we have a lot of phenomenology in this, but we attempt not to be dogmatically anti-cognitivist. So for example, the first time we published, we submitted the cultural affordances paper for publication, we had a lot of Paul Grice's philosophy of mind in it, the idea that meaning is derived through what we can infer, that what other people attempt to convey, trying to pick up on communicative intent. And the enactivist who reviewed our paper said, I don't think you need Grice for that, it's just sort of automatic embodied. And we also mechanistically draw on, I don't know if it's a metaphor or I don't know if it's a formal model of the predictive processing variational free energy model, which is also an old story. So a story according to which reality is, you could call it a hallucination or an illusion or a projection, say from a more psychoanalytic perspective, or you can also call it, in predictive processive terms, a prediction. So the brain is in the business of picking up from prior experience and generating a statistical model of what is likely to arise next in experience, leading to, again, the very, very old philosophical story that you find in Plato's allegory of the cave, that you find in most Buddhistic and Vedic philosophy of mind. Yes, you see the world as you expect it to be, but not as it actually is. So it's also just very, very interesting to me, and I don't really have time to go into the sort of interdisciplinary tensions around this, and why is it that, say, once people settle in the inactivist camp, if you invoke Plato, that's it, they hate you already. If you invoke Descartes, you're completely gone. And I think people are just confusing their normative commitments with their ontologies. And it now also seems to me that the whole post-structuralist idea, say Derrida's critique of Lévi-Strauss, saying, well, you know, binary oppositions are bad. It's a normative claim. We ought not to think too much in these terms. But ontologically or epistemologically, this is sort of how the mind works. So again, people ethically have objections to Plato because of this idea of maybe the philosopher king, this idea that, you know, it takes a privileged kind of person or context to exit the cave. Or ontologically, they think it's impossible to exit the cave. Reality is always going to be an illusion. But again, maybe not. Maybe there are ways not to exit your statistical model of the world altogether, but certainly to broaden the field of possibility. So here, and thank you, Iris Rappaport, one of our brilliant students at McGill who has now defected to Israel, did this diagram for us. So this is the idea that cognitive and conscious states come in varieties of entropy, varieties of possible states. So different kinds of psychopathology, for example, it might be overly rigid, so your mental model of the world is just too much of the same, or overly chaotic, it's just completely meaningless. What is very interesting to me, something that I would like to pursue the rest of my life's work to do, is to attempt to map out how environmental complexity and social complexity is also mapped out at the level of cultural, of cognitive complexity. But I'm saying a lot of things, and I know we're all coming from different disciplinary traditions, so let me just start the story again, very simplistically. The idea being that we don't encounter the world as it is, but as we expect it to be. And it seems that the predictive processing / free energy story, as proposed by Carl Friston, Anil Seth, and others, is offering us quite a bit of mathematical precision to tell this story. But we find that there is something missing in this story, in particular other minds, in particular other people. So the predictive processing story is also, some of you may or may not be familiar with the different debates in the philosophy of mind about whether or not the mind is like a Swiss Army knife that has lots of different devices that are evolved to deal with different problems, or whether it's just a sort of a general mechanism that applies itself to different situations. On the predictive processing account, it seems as though the mind is a more sort of general machine in the business of making statistical predictions. However, we may still remain attentive to different domains of statistical regularities about which we make predictions. And in the predictive processing story, the mind just picks up on external states of the world and generates its model, and then prediction errors occur and so forth. The argument that we make in the Thinking Through All the Mind papers is that for humans, at least, the most important realm of statistical regularities is other minds. It's folk psychologies. So we don't just pick up on what is available in the world, what the world offers, but what we expect other people like us to also expect that the world offers. And this is what I'm going to attempt to explain by didactically taking you through different ways of thinking about affordances. So let me skip some of these. Yeah, I don't have time to do this, but there's all kinds of fun tricks to sort of show how we are culturally primed in different ways to attribute meaning and valence to different features of the world. But let's just sort of move on, and let's explore the notion of affordances, which is, for those of you who are not familiar, I'm going to explain in a minute. But here's another, I think, really interesting, really serious philosophical problem. Aesthetics, right? Axiology, really difficult. So here you have two characters, one of which in most urban university trendy circles would not be considered cool or trendy, one which sort of would be. I mean, this is kind of old, but when I started presenting these slides in 2014, the hipster guy was really cool. I guess he's maybe not that cool anymore. But how is it that without explicit instruction, through a process of implicit enculturation into communities of style and, I don't know, intellectual practice, you know, we come to get an instant sense of awe or disgust upon encountering just symbolically marked persons, and that really affects, you know, the way we trust them, the way we can fall in love or not with them. And most of these cues are, it seems, completely arbitrary. And why does it change over time? So why do these affordances change from person to person, from group to group, and from historical moment to historical moment? But is there a patterning, and how does it work? So the notion of affordances, for those of you who may not know, we owe to the psychologist James Gibson, who was studying visual perception. And it's a way, I guess, to think about interactional properties. It's a way to think about the properties of the environment. So a cup, for example, affords, solicits, or invites drinking. This is, you know, one of the vanilla examples. A chair affords sitting, or a wall affords running into. Okay. But a cup does not have the intrinsic property of potability. It does so interactionally only for an organism that has maybe opposable thumbs, that has a mouth, that requires water, and okay. We're going to go quickly into problematizing how this works for humans. So affordances, yeah, they describe possibilities for action that are available in a neurological niche, but developmental psychologists used to think of affordances as only those features of the environment that can be understood individually without instruction, and in particular without social learning. So in developmental psychology, for example, there's a debate about the use of tools among chimpanzees. So some chimpanzees and some bonobos, they use sticks to fish for termites and termite mounds. But we don't know if this is something that a chimp can individually rediscover in each generation, or whether there is intergenerational learning. There seems not to be, because there is no evidence of intergenerational accumulation and iteration, no ratchet effect, as it were. So for the longest time, psychologists said affordances are interesting, but they don't really apply to humans, because most of what humans do depends on these arbitrary symbolic conventions, so not affordances. So, okay, but as we're going to keep seeing, and I'm sure most of you have thought about this, when it comes to how we learn to be enculturated, how we learn to develop particular tastes, particular likes, and so forth, we have a classical poverty of stimulus problem, such as the one posed by Chomsky, when he looked at the way in which children learned to string utterances together without having to be effortfully, explicitly taught syntax. So it's the same. There are these cultural grammars that we pick up on even without knowing that we do. It is the case with implicit bias, for example, implicit racism, or our taste for, I don't know, fashion. So here, when I present this to my undergraduate students, we go through the long didactic, you know, what does this afford? So people say, well, it affords respect, or it affords status. Okay, so here there's a status symbol. But of course, if you introduce another Q in this ecology of Q, then this will denote a subordinate status. This is someone who, in a particular context, will serve you. If you introduce another set of cues, then it might either afford threat or security. So if you're socially constituted as a sort of undesirable ethnic other, then you might have internalized a sense that this person is out to get you. But if you have grown up more dominant in the system, you might have internalized the sense that this person is there to protect you. So how people automatically attend to cues, it triggers really automatic embodied responses that are patterned in some ways. So these are affordances. But again, how are they learned? Same with the chair. Chair affords sitting, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but chairs also afford, I could get up on it, do a backflip right now if I can do that, or I could throw it at Pierre's face. In fact, but most of you are not. Look at, you're all obeying situationally specific, in fact, even gender-specific ways of sitting, ways of not getting up, ways of not throwing the chair in my face. There's an infinite combinations of things that you're not allowed to do with chairs that you don't know that you're not allowed to do, but in fact, At the embodied level, you do. These are also very stable affordances. Some chairs have very special status. So this one affords not sitting for all but the monarch. So I've also given some examples. This is just another way to represent how, depending on social status and how people within the same groups are constituted, the environment affords radically different things. So here you might have a high status and a low status subject going through the École Normale Supérieure. So for me, I've now acquired a high enough status subject. I can go to university anywhere. I feel comfortable. I make friends. I'm sort of relaxed. I get this sense of pride, whatever. There are many people, as you know, for whom being here would be extraordinarily intimidating, for whom the automatic embodied response would be cortisol surge right away, a shift in posture, hypervigilance all of a sudden. So the same environment predictably affords different things. So same with the sort of the policeman example is again interesting because what we attempt to describe in cultural affordances is the implicit selective patterning of attention. So the way in which Tim Ingold talks about the education of attention, it's a brilliant metaphor. I regret that Tim Ingold is such a rabid anti-cognitivist. That's just a side story that only the anthropologist will find funny. But yeah, so subject one and the high status and low status subject find themselves in a dark alley right away. What do they attend to? So first, the subject number one sees the racialized others, automatic fear response. Oh no, he's going to mug me. Even if, and subject number one, mind you, might be a sort of educated, you know, de la gauche bien pensante, who would really not like to be a racist, but he will get this automatic implicit racist response. Then he sees the policeman and he feels reassured. But subject number two, the racialized other, probably doesn't even see the dominant person, right away sees the policeman and the affordance is threat. So let's go through a few other ways in which space and features of the world are symbolically inscribed in such a way as to produce rather stable affordances. So as a parent and as a cognitive anthropologist, I'm always interested in the implicit education of bad behavior in children. For example, cultures in which children are really unbearable and fussy and others in which they're not. So here, imagine, suppose a vanilla suburban house, you know, with a 1 bedroom per child and a middle-class family. What does the child's bedroom afford? Well, in the afternoon, it might afford just play. The same house, if the parents are out of reach, if the child can make a semi-explicit inference to the extent that parents are not likely to enforce a rule, the room might afford minimally transgressive play. So you do things that you know you're not supposed to get away with, but it's all completely patterned. It's all ritualized, even though it's never explicitly taught. Now, the same room at night affords fussiness. It affords fear. Mind you, again, not in all cultures, but our kids learn selectively, predictably, how to be fussy eaters, how to be fussy about going to bed, and how, I'm going to attempt to explain it. So here again, the child, you know, the parents are out of reach, just feared and afraid and you know, terrified. If the parents are within ear reach, then probably the child, it'll afford crying as a way to kind of elicit care. So how does it happen? We're not sure, but you know, something to do with implicitly picking up on what other people expect of you. So our understanding of cultural affordances is that they're always normative and deontic in a sort of a Wittgensteinian language game kind of way. You can only ever improvise and iterate within a language game, within a set of behavioral possibilities that you have extrapolated from what you know other people like you expect of you. In a minute, if I have time, I'll present a more fine-grained typology of, well, we don't just learn anything from anyone, and it's not just from the in-groups. There are, again, recipes of epistemic powers and epistemic authority in terms of who we outsource our behavior to. Briefly, this is taken from Eric Riedfeld's work. Of course, your affective baseline drastically changes and alters the affordances in the world. So you might imagine walking through a city, a normal ecology of cues in the world. If you're in a depressive, anhedonic state, all the cues might seem flattened. The world might afford very different things. I remember presenting this once, and Jesse Prince, the philosopher, said, well, if you're really depressed, the buildings afford jumping, for example. That's a good point. In a sort of a negative rumination state, maybe all the cues are just similarly threatening. So same, with OCD, you'll have one cue that'll be much more salient than others, and the rest will be selectively clouded from attention. In different kinds of schizotypal states, you'll see hidden dangerous cues everywhere. In fact, you will see hidden social intentions everywhere. You will see minds who want to do things to you and hidden meaning everywhere. ADHD, I guess you selectively, like my style, you selectively attend in no particular order to different cues. Again, in passionate love, you misleadingly see cues about your object of love interest everywhere. Okay, but let's go back to the intersubjective context that also, perhaps not entirely shapes, but certainly modulates affect in all kinds of interesting ways. So our subject number one has been waking up every morning and experiences sustained low mood. You know, he's not feeling too good. He's not feeling too jolly. So in attributing meaning to the interoceptive experience, what's going on? What am I feeling? What does it entail? What's going to happen next? Well, inevitably, again, you draw on widespread beliefs about particular things, particular semantic categories like major depressive disorder, ideas about invisible particles like serotonin and etc. An idea, again, this is all very implicit about generalized others who also believe the same things, and perhaps other people that you also know that have the same kinds of experiences. How am I doing for time? Oh, good. Okay, so I should be able to wrap up. Okay, so I've presented what I hope is an interesting but still somewhat mysterious account of the patterning of affordances in the world. Some variations in variability that is not random, and I've begun to make a case that it has something to do with implicit social learning, with outsourcing, as it were, salience, what to attend to, how to attend to it, and how to feel about it, and what to do next to other people. And I'm going to attempt to present a little bit more, if not evidence, arguments that our mental lives are always saturated with others, with other minds. So it's still a very interesting question that neuroscience and neurotechnology has certainly tragically failed to answer. What goes on in people's minds from moment to moment and from context to context? Do people think in words? Do people think in embodied imagery? Is there differences, cultural differences, individual differences? What is going on? So we might look at a few proxy examples, again, to try to reverse engineer a basic theory of ordinary cognition and consciousness. We might look a little bit at what we know from mind wandering, dreaming, delusions, and smartphone addiction, which is my latest pet project. So yeah, by most accounts, many of you know this, up to 50% of our mental lives is dedicated to actually not paying attention to what we're supposed to pay attention to. I know many of you right now are thinking about other things that are not me speaking. That's okay. That's to be expected. So here, Zachary Erdving, in an interview with Nature Neuroscience, he explains like a typical series of mind moment when someone is attempting to just think about a grocery list, going to the grocery store and walking, and thinks about the new shirt that they bought, a joke they heard, and they start fantasizing about their next trip to Lake Tahoe with friends, then starts worrying about a looming work deadline, and then the mind is constrained back to the grocery list. Now, applying a bit of imaginary microphenomenology to this series of really interesting mind moments, well, what's going on? It seems to me the new shirt, bought for whom? Perhaps a rehearsed thought about for whose eyes? Projected for whom? A joke you heard, well, easily from whom? How many of us have never had moments where we're rehearsing either past conversations, this is how I should have sounded on my date, it would have been a lot better, or this is what I'm going to tell my boss, actually rehearsing conversations. The next trip, well, with whom, you know, and so on and so forth. The looming work deadline is very interesting. If I have the time, there's something about epistemic authority there, about in particular the kinds of high status agents to whom we more explicitly outsource our fears and anxieties. So our parents first, our teachers, our bosses. Because often we attempt to exemplify the theory of cultural affordances by saying that we always have an implicit scenario, sort of like, what would mommy want me to do in the back of our minds? Or what would our hero think? Like, say, what would Wittgenstein think of this theory? Okay, so 50%, these are just sort of estimates. The theories of dreaming, we don't need to get into debates about functionalist accounts of dreaming. It seems to me that they can simply just all be simplified to what happens in dreaming. Well, there are other people. We're rehearsing being social people. In particular, we are rehearsing affectively charged scenarios having to do with the kinds of attachment we have to people we care about the most or we fear the most. Dreaming is just extraordinarily affective. It's very, very social. And it's a way, if we are to believe what may or may not count as evidence, in daydreaming, as in dreaming, we are just consolidating, rehearsing our ordinary consciousness as something that is social through and through. We also see it in all delusions. This is my other mentor, Ian Gold, with his brother Joe Gold, in their book on how culture shapes madness. They have an interesting, if somewhat naive theory of evolutionary theory of delusion having to do with the sort of the threat detection and the cheater detection system going on overdrive. So they subscribe to a somewhat simplistic Machiavellian account of human intelligence, but they say, well, we think about other people all the time. We need to know whether they're telling the truth, whether mommy really likes you or not. So we're always making semi-explicit inferences about what's in other people's minds. And in all the known types of delusions, if you really boil down what it's always about the relationship between the self and other people. In the cognitive science of religion, there's many interesting hypotheses about even the rise of organized monotheistic religion having to do with the very intuitive practice of having a supernatural God or a supernatural entity just watching you. And it becomes a very convenient way for large-scale normative systems to spread, so people are solitarily rehearsing what's good or bad, their own normative expectations, because they expect that God can watch them. And it seems to me there's nothing paradigmatically different in that God example. It's just a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more hierarchical, but we're always in attempting to find meaning and value in our lives. The claim goes, we're always feeling like we're being watched by sort of imaginary others. So this is my hypothesis that people seem to like about what is this really, really extraordinarily addictive substance that make us addicted to smartphones. It's not just the red lights, it's not just the way Facebook and Apple engineered it, it's because it gives us access to what we crave the most. We crave the most, more than salt, more than sugar, more than sex itself. We want social connections. We want social monitoring. We want to watch others and we want to be watched. We want to judge others and we want to be judged in return. And now, with smartphones, we have literally extended our consciousness. We have made it literal, and we have access all the time to literal social monitoring. And it's really, really addictive. It's very, very difficult. So this is a long story. I'm only telling you the details there, but this is why it's very intuitive. You're about to go on a vacation, and you start thinking right away, not about the experiences you'll have, but about the Instagram post you'll make, and about how many likes you'll get, and about whether or not that girl you like will actually like the post. Okay, so there. Yeah, I think I don't need to go in that much more detail because then it'll just get confusing. Probably, hopefully we can have a little bit of a conversation. But I did want to talk just a little bit. Do I have the slide somewhere?
Like 5 minutes more.
What? Yeah. Yeah, so there's interesting paradigms in developmental psychology. So Gurdjieff and Chisbra's notion of natural pedagogy. In the cultural evolution camp, people like Joe Henrich, Dan Sperber, and colleagues to different extents are really interested in the kinds of cognitive biases for social learning and for outsourcing salient and relevant information to others in kinds of implicit ways. And so the research question here is can we flesh out a kind of a typology of cues that are likely to have really high epistemic authority. So things that will tend to automatically direct our attention and be deemed high fidelity, high quality kind of information. We have every reason to believe that for humans, it's always to some extent attached to status, to social status and to prestige in particular. So Joe Henrich and colleague have written quite extensively and eloquently about the evolution of the prestige bias. But even Marcel Mauss was already writing about it, and Gabriel Tarde to some extent, in trying to understand the laws of imitation. So it seems that prestige and status for humans shares a not so distant phylogenetic evolutionary connection with the dominance hierarchies that you still find among our mammal cousins, but for humans, prestige does not need to entail brute force. So there you have, for example, Antonio Gramsci's notion of hegemony also tells the same story. So we sort of implicitly give our consent that the world is a particular way, but there are some stories that we find catchier than others. And without instruction, we know usually how to identify someone who's good at a particular skill. So age is often a good proxy, but not necessarily. In experimental conditions, when you put people in a lab and they have to learn a new skill, if they really have no idea, they'll try to know, okay, who's good, who can teach me the skill? So they'll intuitively go towards older people, but if they find a younger person who has expertise, they will trade age for expertise. So we also have an expertise bias. And it seems that just about pretty much exhausts it. Is just about being able to identify prestige. This is why, and again, as noble as it may be normatively to want to create societies without hierarchies, pedagogies without hierarchies, and so forth, we're probably shooting ourselves in the foot if we expect that humans are not going to care about status, or status is just this evil invention of capitalism, and that it's just otherwise not there. So I won't go into it too much, but for those of you who are not familiar with it, who are interested in ways to study people's implicit expectations, I direct you to different methods. Cultural domains analysis is one, and free listing is also a very interesting one as well. So when you want to sort of discover a culturally relevant category, don't take it for granted, but sort of get a group of people together and first query them individually and say, well, for example, what is an ideal husband like? Or what's a good marriage like? And then people will list lots of different things individually. Then you get all your lists together, and if you find that an item tends to recur, or it tends to recur at the top of the list, so order of mention and frequency of mention will give you an indicator of a sort of cultural salience. So that's one way, for example, to try to reconstruct locally meaningful categories. I don't have time to go into now the question of just cultural variations, but it seems to me that human cultural variations are grossly overinflated by cultural anthropologists, and that mostly humans do more of the same. They iterate cultural practices along a few similar themes. So the old ones, kinship, marriage, house, exchange, and then where you will find significant differences is at the level of the valence that is attributed to different things. So for example, now we have a project where we investigate people's views of gender and gender roles. And it's fascinating that across cultures and across ages, people give us the same definitions. So men are stronger and women are more caring, for example. But then some people will say women are forced to be more caring and men are more violent. They describe the same things, but they just assign a different valence to it. So that's also, we're beginning to think now about the attributed valence to basically universal features of the world being something like a really interesting locus of cultural variations. I've said a lot. I think I can stop now, and hopefully there are questions.
Okay, thank you.
So
Samuel.
the discussant, thank you.
I'm trying to process this huge amount of information, and my question would be about the explanatory power of your theory, and especially linked to the problem of institution. I was wondering, in your framework, which is all about overminds, intersubjectivity, cultural affordances, and micro-phenomenology, institution like École Normale Supérieure, possession ritual, as you described first, beginning your talk, or even Apple, comes as given. I mean, the people you describe are trying to have affordances, variable affordances toward these institutions, but I was wondering if in this kind of framework you have a way to explain the emergence, stabilization, and then obsolescence of this institution, which are usually one of the stereotypes of what we think as a cultural phenomenon. So this would be my tricky question.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. I mean, I tend to think of institutions like John Searle, right, as something that emerges as varieties of institutional facts that only exist because people implicitly agree that they exist. Let me make a brief detour. I'm also very interested in the over-attribution of agency because our mind is so social, in the way in which in everyday language and in everyday assumptions, we attribute agency to institutions and indeed to large groups as though they have a mind. So we will say the École Normale Supérieure doesn't let you do that, or like the media controls your mind, or like, you know, Israel is bad and like, you know, the US is sort of good. So probably it seems to me that institutions are also just a way in which as societies become too complex and too large, they become a sort of an almost natural heuristic of simplification to organize, you know, the sort of spread of systems of meaning. But again, I want to insist that this almost invariably occurs organically and from the bottom rather than from the top. So as much as, again, ethically we may want to say, well, we would be better off organizing our lives otherwise, but it seems that, again, to put a sort of a predictive processing take on the Weber McDonaldization thesis also, it seems to be an almost inevitable process of societies that have too many people that they will organize themselves into those kinds of deeply depersonalized institutions. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, so you mentioned at some point very early in the talk the issue of the aesthetics of the faces. It just came actually, I gave a talk in the MPI. There's an MPI, you know, MPI is appearing always in everyday insurance.
MPI, the Max Planck? Yeah.
And they seem to be very, very interested in what makes a face beautiful. And they have this theory that basically, you know, there is a distribution of faces that you have seen throughout your life. And if you have an outlier from the distribution, you will judge it as ugly. And basically, you can parameterize a face, you know, based on, you know, distance between the eyes and so on. And you can even train people by exposing to a certain distribution, asking, you know, well, this face is beautiful or not, and then showing them outliers from the distribution as the ugly. Which I found like a rather silly approach, you know, because in the essence, basically, we have been exposed to faces that are European. So then you mentioned the issue of the smartphones, and I have to say I'm a huge fan of Tinder as a tool of scientific research. I think it can be really used for that. Actually, if you take it close, you can basically go to different locations in the world, show faces that actually come from the statistics of the faces that are at the places where you're showing, you know, for example, you know, you can take the average face in Hong Kong, for example, and create a profile, fake profile, of course, and then you can have give all lives as one. That's for even my girlfriend, by the way, I was using my own face. I don't know, I was just lucky. But in a sense, you would use a fake profile, and you can all through the world use basically the faces that are more like fitted to the, you know, to the places where you're using Tinder, and the proxy of how well they like is the number of likes that you get back. So my question is whether you think that will work, or basically everything will boil down that everybody in the world will like European faces, blonde, Swedish.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, there's a lot of things there. Don't have time to get into the ethics of the smartphone thing too much, except that to make the claim again that smartphones are just a literal extension of human consciousness. Even Google and Wikipedia, we have literal cultural learning. Now we have access to like the cumulative repertoire of what other people have devised, and we can do it. So smartphones, it's the old question, is human nature good or bad? It's both, whatever. So smartphones are both really good and really bad. It's just human consciousness on steroids. But there's a few things that are not going to change. Like, for example, likes are an indicator of social attention. So they're an indicator of prestige. And strength in numbers, social proof, etc., that's like a deep, deep, deep cognitive bias. It's really difficult. It takes like 40 years of Buddhist wisdom to disengage yourself from that. Now, well,
being actually seeing the Great Wall and thinking on the way of taking the Instagram picture, but I might as well enjoy as much being on Instagram or doing the real thing. So is it really a problem, or is it has changed?
I think it's too complicated a story. I would say that yes, it's probably going to precipitate apocalypse really quickly, but we can talk about it over drink. But I do want to talk about faces a little bit, because I think the perception of beauty in faces is a good way to think about a hierarchy of priors in predictive processing terms, some evolutionarily older and some evolutionarily younger, therefore more cross-culturally variant. So if you research in ethology shows quite well that there's things like Kindenschema, cuteness traits. So bodily symmetry, round eyes, etc. Things will be universally recognized as beautiful. A grossly asymmetrical face with black teeth and a missing nose will be universally ugly. So the perception of human beauty is symbolically enriched within some evolutionary limits. However, and this is probably going to be contentious for some of you, but if you look at the well-documented differences between men and women in mating strategies, where on average, women are more attentive to social status and men are more attentive to genetic status. So on this view, which is also corroborated by the fact that many more men are in the autistic spectrum, women are more culturally updated. So maybe for women, it's sort of like, well, the symbolic cues that index much more reliably than genetic status and a person's ability to be well inserted in the social context matter more, whereas for men, they're more trapped in a sort of a Lolita complex where they require something like very simple and symmetrical. So again, there's just interesting kinds of hierarchies of priors where, again, the symbolic cues, evolutionarily younger, more variable, and some people care about it more than others, and I would argue that women are more culturally updated than men on average.
Would you agree to say that cultural affordances, when applied to people, as the implicit part of theory of mind?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the basic building block, but it still doesn't solve the problem. It's sort of like, and as you know, there's lots of debates about just how explicit it is and when and how it develops and whether it is required for social coordinations. Very brief example, in our placebo machine experiment, we had a 7-year-old autistic, severely autistic child who did not understand the nature of the suggestion. So I was convinced that it wouldn't work because he didn't understand, he was very sort of fidgety, but his father was really, really just enchanted, with the whole thing. And we were able to induce really strong effects in a child who, in many ways sort of lacks theory of mind. So again, in order for these elaborate placebo effects to work, you need to have good theory of mind and pick up on cultural affordances. So on the hypothesis that deficient theory of mind would make you incapable of picking up on cultural affordances, and again, if you look at the literature on placebo effects in even nonverbal autistic children, there is an effect, probably having to do with social interactions and the effect of their caregivers' expectations.
Would you agree to say that affordances might be normative?
Yes.
I'm thinking about the paper of Clément and Kaufman about deontic affordances.
Oh, I have not seen that. I need to see that paper because we're making an argument about deonticity.
Yeah. They say that applied to interaction, affordances might also be normative. It's not only what you can do, but what you should do with.
Absolutely, it's what you think you ought to do as per particular cultural normative frameworks. 100%. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much for an amazing talk. You claimed that the perception of affordance is determined not only physical properties of the object and like the biological capacities of us, but also by like internalized other minds.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it seems to me that the internalized other minds could be analyzed in terms of like the normative beliefs that I have, like what we should do in some context or what we shouldn't do in some context. Do you agree with that? Or other minds have something more which cannot be only analyzed by the normative beliefs, standard normative beliefs?
Yeah, but by normative, most of which I think is implicit. But again, thank you for reiterating that. The claim is that we don't pick up on the affordances of the world, but we pick up on the world as it is symbolically marked. So again, that sounds fancy, but what does it mean? And it's particularly because you have these inter-individual, intergroup differences that you understand that the patterning has something to do with implicit social learning. So first, you go through a realm of statistical regularities in your expectations about other minds, and then you go through the world. And again, evolutionarily and developmentally, there's a kind of a trajectory for that. And yes, I think you've both made that point. I'm glad you did. That it's not just about how you expect the world to be, but how you expect that the world ought to be. Yeah, because we are deeply moral creatures in the most shallow sense of imitation. Yeah.
So, listening to you speak, it makes me go back to, and often always in this, go back to Heidegger.
Yeah, sure.
Because, what you talk about, the normative, what Heidegger calls das Man, is the kind of like what everyone thinks, and that's the kind of the normative, affordances. And also a reflection of technology, when we're talking about smartphones and smart things, something you just said about, do you think that those kind of ideas about like the being of technology being a different kind of being to human being as a relevant in this kind of case, could those ideas be useful?
I'm not sure. I don't think there's anything new under the sun, and I think technology is simply, it's always an extension and an exponentialization of a human skill, but then we're able to do that on steroids. So language is the first technology already is super
what Heidegger wants to say is that technology has its own kind of being that is different to humans, and we're kind of forced to accept that being, and that's changing the nature of what it means to be human.
Yeah, I guess I don't know Heidegger enough to comment on that, because it just seems a little naive to me, because we are through and through a technological species. I don't even understand how we might be humans, without the extended mind and embedded extended mind and technologies.
Thanks. So my question would be that you mentioned this metaphor of a cave, like exiting your cave, or nature in general. And I'm curious how we could maybe create cultural practices that would support that, or enable people to be able to do that. So one example, maybe in school you learn sort of that you have to perform to some external standard, or you're not really, you're not important, you cannot influence, you are not, basically. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think, again, in school, most of what you learn is implicit. It's what, pedagogy scholars call the hidden curriculum, and you learn a lot of things about hierarchies of social status, about hierarchies of cultural capital. It's never explicitly taught. You internalize your position that way. In terms of intentionally creating cultural practices that open up the fields of possibility so we're a little less rigid, well, they exist, and it's called wisdom. And I think it's called wisdom for a reason, because it's difficult, it's counterintuitive. So Stoicism is one. I think Buddhism is one. I think taking psychedelics can be one. I think whatever invites you to be a little less rigid, a little more open, and to sort of question your automaticity. But it's not easy, and it's not granted for everyone. And then there are shortcuts. So again, perhaps psychedelics offer a shortcut under some guidance. The kinds of placebo experiments that we do offer shortcuts. But it seems to me that if we understand these processes of behavior being largely sort of automatic, and then if ethically we have a story that it's sort of not very good, metaethically and normatively there are some, and politically there are some important sort of conclusions. For example, about our naive belief in democracy, when let people vote and well, just look what happens. Like, need I say more? So again, there's, at least from my perspective, there's an invitation to reconsider Plato, certainly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We know this Magdalena again for the last talk of the day. So,
Ah oui, je le laisse.
C'est un PowerPoint, ok. Ah, attends. Enlever le miroir, voilà. Alors.
waiting for Madame being ready. We are running a bit late, like 30 minutes, and then it's like to be like the last talk of the day with Madalena, and then everybody is invited to join everybody to have beer or whatever, like Madalena and Pasteur. And
Ok, super.
Hi, Maddalena Canna. I was trained in social anthropology in the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences, École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and I'm starting a project at Northwestern University leading towards a conception of biosocial anthropology. My talk today will be an exploratory talk about my forthcoming project. I will discuss some methodological and epistemological issues concerning the integration of biomedical technologies and natural context ethnography. The core hypothesis is that paradoxical injunctions induce specific alteration of consciousness, fostering the transmission of counterintuitive beliefs. I've got two ethnographic focuses which I would like to explore in this sense. A one-year doctoral fieldwork on pathogenic trance among the mosquitoes of Nicaragua, and a 2 years postdoctoral fieldwork on meditative trance in US Ramakrishna ashrams. What is common between both is a form of induced hallucinatory trance, which is held as pathological in the first cases and has the integrated, socially integrated and the spiritual experience in the second. And so we'll discuss questions about the frontier, the porous frontier between the pathological and the not pathological, and what social criteria are relevant to understand how it is built and then they negotiate it. Methodologically, the point will be to integrate biomedical technology, for example, using portable field-friendly devices to search for distinctive biomarkers of dissociative states associated to counterintuitive beliefs, and the typical approach, ethnographical approach of immersive participant observation. My first focus, I'll skip some points. My first focus is one year of ethnographic fieldwork among the mosquitoes, which are an Afro-Indigenous Caribbean population living between eastern Nicaragua and Honduras. You can see in red the area. Greasy sickness, literally is a calque from English, crazy sickness, is a form of involuntary trance attack, mainly affecting young mosquito women. Locally, greasy sickness is experienced as a contagious syndrome, triggering an hetero or autoaggressive behavior, with some points in common of hysteria, what was called hysteria in the charcoal times. The mosquito term greasy sickness translates approximately as crazy sickness, but it corresponds also to Lasaplucan in indigenous languages, which is attack, spirit attack by an evil spirit. Denotes a fact of hallucinogenic trance attacks which have been occurring in mosquito territory in the last few years. These are the main outbreaks, the main historical outbreaks in the first map, and the second map shows the outbreak which takes place during my ethnographic fieldwork. The outbreaks are very violent. People are intended becoming aggressive to destroy dwell and terrorize themselves. So they have to be restrained. Just a brief note on mosquitoes. The population number is about 1,050 people now, and they are language belongs to Malpateng. And it was connected with macro, more from the Amazonia than from also the Mesoamerican tradition. What interested me in greater sickness was, first of all, a complex interplay between pathological symptoms and ritualized aspects. Seizures are not predictable, even if in some cases they are expectable, and are associated with recurrent hallucinations. During trance, greasy sickness attacked individuals feel the presence of a sort of antagonist, ambivalent spirit agent, which is described as a seducer and an aggressor at the same time, which nature and identity remain uncertain. The spirit can sometimes take the appearance of a duende, which is a dwarf, a typical dwarf diffused all throughout all Hispanic world, which is recognizable by his four-fingered hand. You can see in the drawing. This is the typical sign of the duende, which is performed also by the attacked people during trance. So attacked people during trance perform a detail of the body of the spirit who is experienced as attacking during the trance. But the people do not become the spirit. It is not like identificatory trance. It's a projective trance where the agent is external, like a demonic attack. So sometimes it is treated by exorcists in a quite Christian-inspired framework. And just some details reveal the presence of the spirit. Sometimes it is associated with Satan. Beyond categorical attributional uncertainty, which is common in a lot of spirit traditions where the spirit is characterized by the fact that it's very difficult to understand who it is, what it is, and so there is a sort of characterization for default. What is held to be initially a jaguar or another animal and proves not to be nor that, nor that, nor that, then it is a spirit because it is elusive, and a lot of ethnography shows that. In the case of greasy sickness, there is more uncertainty about the ontology of the spirit, because the uncertainty is at the core of the sense of existence of its being. Attacked people doubt of the real existence of this being, not about the attributional ontology or what kind of being it is, but it exists or not. And this is a point which leads to a series of theoretical problems. We can define it in Tanya Luhrmann's terms like a contingent, fluctuating, and context-dependency ontology of the spirit. The prevalent explanation is that the attacked people experience the spirit as real because of the psychophysiological alteration induced by trance. There is a sort of bias in the explanation of the crisis of the seizure, which should be provoked by an agent, which comes to existence by the consciousness alterations induced by attack. And so it is at the same time the cause and the effect of the trance attack and of the alteration of consciousness. This utterance by an indigenous Micoulaud experiencing the trance is particularly relevant of this paradox. El duende es psicólogo, si vos sos crédulo y tenés miedo en esas cosas, entonces él se aprovecha para existir. Es decir, Duduhindo is a psychologist. If you're credulous and you believe in such things, then he takes advantage and exists. This point encouraged me to explore the problem of the attribution of reality and of the sense of paradox in the altered states of consciousness connected with dissociative experiences. My methodology on the field was, I chose to use an interactive collaboration, and I proposed to the people attacked to to create drawings about the attacking spirit. I worked with 44 girls and 4 boys. The average age of the attacked people is 16, so it's a typical teenage syndrome. And of course, trance arrives with no psychotropic intake. It is not connected to any ritualistic context, even if it manifests itself in a quite semi-ritualized way. I proposed to my interlocutors to draw their hallucinatory visions while they were narrating. Drawing was interpreted locally as a therapy. Indeed, despite of being an unusual practice in the mosquito, drawing has been appropriated by mobilizing interpretative skills coming from shamanistic traditions. As shamans extract the evil, Saura Sakaya, from patients, drawing was a variant of such extractions technique, in which the evil represented on the sheet stood for the pathogenic extracted elements. This unexpected and creative appropriation of drawing allowed me for integrating ethnographic practice into the ethics of greater sickness healing. I became a healer in a sense. And to explore the interaction between events, post-hoc narratives, and meaning attribution. The hallucinatory iconography resulting from the comparison of the corpus of drawings forms a coherent and sophisticated idiom of distress, which has very little inspiration from models that we can find in the mosquito. We can imagine that a lot of drawing, a lot of representation of the spirit can induce or inspire this hallucination. This is not like that. There is a very rich culture of inner image and a very poor culture of production of external iconographies. So I decided to study how internal or implicit representation can be transmitted in a so coherent way, almost in the absence of a material iconography. In the analysis of its dynamics, I was initially prone to adopt Dan Sperber's cultural epidemiology framework. At first sight, in fact, an epidemiological model of cultural transmission based on representations seemed perfectly relevant to the analysis of such cases of propagation. Indeed, images of greasy sickness and any other representations concerning the seizure are experienced as a possible mean of contagion. People say you can get a contagion by imaging this spirit, and so the image is the virus that provokes the seizure and the illness. I realized that local ideologies about greasy sickness contagion are convergent with Dan Sperber's model, but that on the pragmatic level, this model is not enough to understand the pragmatism and the embodied aspect of greasy sickness transmission. And I have advanced the hypothesis that the interactional pattern characterizing the interaction between the attacked people and non-attacked are sort of meaningful transactions, creating and allowing for every person to produce its own interpretation of a common representation. So this is not the characteristics of the representations, but the way in which people are interacting that builds a sort of continuous reproduction internal projections. A context-sensitive notion of ontologies is needed to account for these dynamics. In the case of greasy sickness, a point was particularly interesting is that these visions were induced by specific pragmatics, which were characterized by paradoxical injunctions. One example of the process is that prospective attacked people or possessed people are exposed to such injunctions like be careful not to care about the spirit. Of course, it's like a technique of non-meditation. So try to concentrate on something that you have to avoid, and it will become stronger and stronger, of course. And so a lot of a series of contradictory stimuli. The same things reflect on the discursive level. During trance attacks, for example, the people are exhorted to give up, to negate the spirit's reality, but at the same time to address the spirit as it was real. For example, tell him he doesn't exist. How can a people tell a spirit, you don't exist, without implicitly create and contributing to its reality, and so on. These are just a few examples. Well, the specificity of this case asks for questioning the role of paradox beyond the specificity of the mosquito situation. The aim of my whole project is to integrate these findings through a biosocial approach of the role of paradox in cultural transmission, accounting for pathological as well as for socially valorized forms. Alors, two main goals. First of all, I think we need to elaborate a definition of paradox in its different modalities: verbal, visual, sensory motor, multimodal, bringing together insights from anthropology and cognitive neurosciences. In this perspective, I published a first article integrating predictive inferential Bayesian models of consciousness and pragmatic analysis. We have to introduce a fourfold distinction to seize and to define the object. At the discursive level, a paradox can be simply a rhetoric figure mobilized in religious narrative. For example, it is typical to find in non-dualistic traditions, or even it seems that in most religious traditions we have notions of paradox or paradoxical notions. At a pragmatic level, we have paradoxical injunction, and on a phenomenological level, paradox is an experience. The experience of paradox needs to be described in its different manifestations, as for example, we can do with trance narratives, with a sort of condensation of contradictory feelings and contradictory states and contradictory sense of realities. And finally, the physiological level. My challenge probably is to understand if paradox has biomedical, paradox can be conceived as biomedical events. It is to say, are there some biomarkers of the phenomenological experience of paradox? And do these four levels can be just impiled, just seen as parallel. There is a representation, a discursive representation of paradoxical notions, for example, Trinity. There is a pragmatic level, paradoxical injunctions, and then the phenomenology, and then the physiology, or how can we integrate and how we can conceive the passages between these levels. My second goal is a hypothesis which has been advanced yet in a lot of anthropological theories from, in part, Carlo Severi and in part Dan Sperber itself. Is paradox a trigger of the emergence and propagations of beliefs? Paradox, the hypothesis is that paradox is at the origin of consciousness alterations appraised as psychopathological, and on this point I come back to Gregory Bateson's hypothesis on the epidemiology of schizophrenia, about the idea that schizophrenia is induced by paradoxical injunction and double binding situations, or as spiritual experiences in the framework of religion and or ritual traditions. This is a quite simplistic scheme, but the point is to understand how paradox can trigger counterintuitive experiences and how these experiences can be related or traduced into beliefs, and so in the inverse sense. And what happens with society, with the negotiation between pathology, pathologization, and social integration. Some experiences can be considered absolutely pathological in one tradition and absolutely spiritually elevating in another. What happens at this level? Then the dichotomy between pathology and religious experience has to be replaced in a continuum depending on the modalities of socialization of the phenomena, which has an influence, of course, on the capability of the subject to exert metacognitive control on these states. The second micro goal is to produce new inquiries on the role of paradox in natural context. I will do some inquiries in the Ramakrishna mission, where there is a particularly strong meditative paradox tradition, I would say. The use of paradoxes to trigger hallucinative states, controlled hallucinative states, quite similar to deity yoga, when a deity emerges, a spiritual being emerges, and it is held to be existent and non-existent at the same time. And sometimes it is accompanied with hallucination. What fascinated me, it was that just I was facing quite the inverse of greasy sickness case in an absolutely totally different cultural context, but from a phenomenological point of view, there were striking similarities to explore. This is the forthcoming ethnographic field. But Ramakrishna Mission or Vedanta Society is a network of ashrams or spiritual centers spread throughout the world, with a headquarters in Belur Math in Bengal in India. They are directed by monks, Swami, and open to lay people. Ramakrishna Mission takes its name from Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, which was a Bengali mystic belonging both to Vedantic and Tantric tradition. And the whole mission has 154 ashrams in India, 14 in the US, and 1 in France, and many others worldwide. I have been attending the activities of the Ramakrishna Ashram of Graz, located at 30 kilometers from Paris since 2015. Initiated by the sacrament of the Mantra Diksha by the president of the Vedic Society of France, Swami Vitamohananda, I am an integrated sympathizer of the Ramakrishna International Community. So I decided to take the position of the participant immersive ethnographer. So I'm an insider of the religious community, and Ramakrishna activities present two particularly relevant points of this study. The first one, the use of visualization meditative techniques, which can lead to states of consciousness phenomenologically very similar to hallucinatory trance, and the systematic use of contradictory injunctions and paradoxical thoughts. This practice is aimed in the framework of a particular synthesis of Vedantic tantric tradition to lead the aspirant to go beyond ordinary consciousness in order to access a superior reality, which is described as the fact of going beyond the threshold of the couple of opposites. So the good and the bad, and presence and absence have to be transcendent in a perspective of a superior unity, or subsumed in a more elevated non-dualistic reality, which is held to be the real existence. This experience of transcendent unity can be associated to trance-like states, like Ramakrishna mystical ecstasies and samadhi. Despite of evident cultural differences, the Ramakrishna's practices presents an interesting case to contrast with Greasy Sickness trance tech. Three main hypotheses of will be tested. First of all, the possible presence of biomarkers of paradoxical states, then the relation between metacognition and interception, and then issues concerning social learning, shifting ethnicity, and the self. The three demand an integration between natural context participant observation, ethnography, and biomedical measurement, neurosciences and biology. About possible biomarkers of paradoxical states, the neuroscientist Robin Carhart-Harris advanced the hypothesis that culturally salient phenomena correspond to neuronal biomarkers, namely that they correspond to neuronal cascades taking place when some critical thresholds are overcome. This is the case, namely, of paradoxical experience used in many religious traditions to overcome ordinary states of consciousness. This is what, on another level, Antaves is a scholar working on cognitive sciences of religion, observes by analyzing William Barnard's post hoc narrative of his non-ordinary experience induced by contradictory thoughts. In brief, William Barnard has an ego dissolution experience provoked by the concentration on the thought of being existent beyond his own death. So this is another sort of involuntary exercise to create a paradox and to provoke a sort of short circuit in a cognitive, we can define it like a sort of cognitive short circuit. Or the problem of cognitive neuronal cascades does not only concern paradoxical states, but I think that they can be powerful triggers. It is plausible then that these neuronal events have measurable physiological correlates. A part of my work will be dedicated to the application of methodologies implemented by Rebecca Seligman and her collaborator at Northwestern, using portable devices to measure physiological variations in natural contexts and in interaction, in situation of interacting meditant people, for example, in the chapel when the mantra is performed collectively. I will test neurophysiological variation in Ramakrishna's meditators before, during, and after visualization practices and paradoxical activations and mantra practices. There are a huge variety kind of meditation skills used. And well, some parameters I will focus particularly on skin conductance, blood pressure, neurohormonal activities by taking samples of blood and saliva, and possibly EEG by portable devices. And of course on the reactivity, cardiac reactivity in relation to autonomic system, to the activity of the autonomic nervous system, so sympathetic and parasympathetic. Adopting such methodologies can solve, apparently, a typical problem of the integration between anthropology and neurosciences. Indeed, while anthropology produces typically thick descriptions, in the words of Gertz, detailed but not measurable and contextualized, so the problem is a sort of entropy in the anthropological ethnographical production, because we tend to produce very detailed contextualized descriptions, but it is extremely difficult to extrapolate data and to generalize and to have biomedical measurements. The use of portable devices can permit both to observe interactions and to collect systematic and predictive data. Of course, recent findings by, for example, Guillaume Dumas and his team on agency biomarkers, and by Guillaume Descaches on social contagion, are particularly promising about the possibility of detecting biomarkers of social interactions in natural contexts. But they have been implemented in lab contexts. So all the challenge, all the questions relies on how to adapt these technologies in a natural context. Or, of course, moreover, recent studies on the neurophenomenology of meditation show that some meditative practices at the neuronal level are at the neurophenomenological level are the inverse of some psychopathologies. For example, sustained attention, which is typical of some meditative traditions, it can be found also in OCD disorders, in obsessional compulsive disorder. So passing from a controlled use to a pathological manifestation can open, for example, the path to treatments and to understanding what's the frontier between pathology and cultural learning. Of course, the field is comparing neuronal correlates of meditation and psychopathologies can show how to transform originally disrupted symptoms in useful or controlled mental skills, even if it is a little utopic. Well, the two different paradigms of biomedical technologies and ethnographic observation, I think it will be productive to keep a sort of friction between both, not to look for a synthesis, but to look at a sort of epistemological, heterogeneously integrated approach. Of course, typical criticism to its approach is that it will change completely the natural context to impose to meditants to wear helmets and so on. But I think that from a reflective point of view, it will be an excuse, it will be an interesting provocative pretext to understand what people believe about sciences, about official sciences, and so to inquire on the so-called ideologies of the brain, how people interpret the beliefs in the effectivity of technological measurements. for example, now it's the case of the Mind and Life Institute, of the more and more diffuse the use of neurosciences to legitimize or to support, to describe scientifically non-dualistic, the effect of meditative non-dualistic traditions has created a sort of ensemble of beliefs, which are sometimes projections, sometimes shared representation, shared cultural representation on a sort of imaginated brain connected to meditative experience. And so it will be a provocative way to inquire on how ethnographied people react and imagine what is behind this sort of practice. I skip quickly about the use of predictive coding. I think it's really interesting to use some predictive coding modeling of delusions and beliefs proposed by Philippe Corlett, and I adapted it in the article I quoted before, whose proposal is that in a normal and standard condition, when predictions encounter are confirmed by responses from the world, there's no change in beliefs, of course. When the responsive of the words force creates prediction errors, we have a readjustment of belief which can be experienced or as an illumination in a spiritual context, or as a delusion, or as a disruptive experience in a pathological one. And hallucination would be characterized by the opposite situation, is to say that predictions are very strong and are not contradicted by any error, by any stimuli, or the stimuli are so low not to contrast sufficient enough predictions, and so we tend to have a sort of effect of projections. This is why deprivation, sensorial deprivations, is a proved way to induce hallucinations, because there's a sort of overpower of predictions, and so the projections are very strong, and there is a sort of lack of mediation with the science from external environment. Second point is the relation between metacognition and interoception. Again, a connection with the Micoulaud ethnography. These are some drawings I collected in the Mosquitia about parasites, bowel parasites. In the Mosquitia, trance attacks are associated with profound physiological deregulations, in particular irritable colon-like syndromes. The possessed people associate abdominal swellings and anorexic states with the belief that they accepted infested food from the spirits. The possibility of the top-down conversion, for example, a belief being somatized, and so a degree of cognitive penetrability, which will be translated into physiological symptoms, is accompanied by its reverse. For example, intestinal parasite infections, like amoebiasis, which is an infection by Entamoeba histolytica, are interpreted as spiritual attacks triggering trance seizures. This is an example, of course, of double biolooping, where physiological states and culturally shaped beliefs interact from lower to higher level on a visceral cerebral integration context, which was studied, between others, by Annie. Or what happens in greasy sickness? The emergence of visceral symptoms, as well as reproductive ones, like dysmenorrhea, a complex of symptoms, correlates with an oversensitive interoception. So the perception of one's internal processes is emphasized to the point of creating alarms in a sort of hypochondrial state. The point is that affected people or possessed people present an altered bodily metacognition, may be reliable to a problem of mismatching predictions, which lead to the over-amplification of nociceptive stimuli or to the interpretation of neutral stimuli as nociceptive over emotionally neutral or positive ones. In other words, these people tend to amplify negative sensation coming from their body and to ignore positive ones, which feeds a looping where negative interceptions lead to negative emotions trigger impairing somatizations, and so on. There are a lot of points in common with what is called in Euro-American biomedical tradition non-epileptic psychogenic seizures, and sometimes panic attacks too. Once again, studying Ramakrishna practices provides a fruitful counterexample to this phenomenon. Many yogis and yoginis claim that they trained their interoceptive awareness to the point of controlling their physiological processes. Studies on the physiology of yoga, which flourished particularly in India since the 19th century, demand to be tested through contemporary field-friendly technologies. Recently, a threefold distinction has been proposed by Garfinkel between interoceptive accuracy or objective interoception, which is the ability to be conscious of a internal process, for example, heart beating or digestion and visceral activity. Interoceptive sensibility or subjective interoception, that is the feeling of being conscious, and the interoceptive awareness, which is the ratio between 1 and 2. Is to say, the ability of monitoring or one's own states, of being aware, of being sensitive, and of predicting correctly what happens to one's own body. This will be tested in a context of experimented yogis, and it will be tested by integrating explicitation, observation, and biomedical measurement. The last point is about social learning. Ramakrishna Math is a transnational community where, under the guidance of Indian monks strictly trained in India, people from different ethnic groups participate in the same rituals, ruled by the central direction of Belur Math, and share the same religious hermeneutics, textual references like, for example, the Yoga Sutras, the Bhagavad Gita, the life of Ramakrishna. As for evangelical churches studied by Tanya Luhrmann throughout the world, the Ramakrishna Math is particularly relevant field to test if different ethnic groups appropriate in distinctive way a common background of hermeneutics and practice. Even within a single ashram, the population is generally divided in three main categories. Hindus educated in India, immigrated population of second or third generations coming from the Indian subcontinent, and then other ethnic groups, mainly belonging to the host country, ethnic majority. Among the latter, ethnic auto-assimilation processes are frequent. Being exposed to an Indian-dominated environment, many non-Hindu yogis and yoginis tend to assume Indian-inspired attitudes going far beyond religious adhesions. For example, they adopt Indian vestimentary codes, Indian names, and some of them declare that they feel Indian. This process of auto-ethnic assimilation can affect profoundly non-Indian yogi's sense of self. I propose to test if such self-transformation processes have effects on the parameters exposed before. I will test the following variables. First of all, if neurophysiological biomarkers considered before may vary according to the ethnic distribution of the population. I will distinguish between subgroups, Indian, immigrated Indians, non-Indians, which can be further distinguished in subgroups in case of statistically relevant ethnic majorities. And in case ethnical distribution is proved relevant, I will test if auto-assimilated non-Indians tend to present the same distinctive physiological patterns of Indians and to immigrated Indians. In particular, I will focus on establishing if the auto-representation of feeling Indian correlates with effective physiological and behavioral similarities. Finally, I will contrast the possible ethnic variability with criteria associated to the duration and intensity of the training. Namely, I will create subgroups of yogis of 10, 5, or 1 year of training experience within each ethnic subgroup and then within the whole ashram community. Finally, I will cross ethnic and training criteria. A similar differentiation can be done also about gender, sex, and age, depending on statistically relevant conditions. Physiological measurement will be integrated with detailed immersive ethnography. This is about methodology. I can just add that I think I will complete with some lab tests, some ERM lab tests, so portable devices and lab tests. These are the main collaborators in the program. I have from, it's a postdoctoral project supported by the Fitness Foundation. In Northwestern University, Rebecca Seligman for anthropology, Doug Medin, Eddie Chen, and Rabin Naslock for neurosciences and psychology. In the interdisciplinary project Science in Human Culture. From University of California, Santa Barbara, Ann Taves, Cognitive Sciences of Religion. From Stanford University, Tanya Luhrmann, Anthropology and Psychology. And the recently deceased Tiziana Zalla has provided inspiring and extremely interesting methodologies and insights from the field of cognitive neurosciences and from the École Normale Supérieure. The ethnographic fields will be Ramakrishna Ashrams of Chicago, Santa Barbara, Berkeley, San Francisco, Hollywood, and Orange County. And these are some questions to discuss finally. For example, if we adopt Philippe Descola' proposition about ontologies, about the distinction about naturalistic ontologies and analogic ontologies, I think in these cases we have to adopt rather a multi-layered notion of ontologies. For example, we can find yogis which adopt a naturalistic paradigm coming from neurosciences, explaining meditative experience with notions taken from neuroscience, but incorporated in analogic beliefs. For example, the idea that the brain is a microcosm of cosmos, and cosmos is a microcosm of a bigger system. So we have this sort of games of layering of different ontologies which has to be taken into considerations. I think we can start the discussion.
Thank you, Magdalena, for this wonderful talk. I would like to come back to the basics of your model, and especially on what you said about paradox. If I understood well, you have a very generous definition of what is a paradox, and if I understood well, once again, your idea basically is that paradoxical condition helps or favors the transmission and propagation of paradoxical representation or paradoxical interaction, stable interaction. Is that it?
This is a quite circular question. I think that paradox is as the heart of belief in general. When is at the heart of counterintuitive belief.
Yeah, so paradox and contradiction basically is melted, okay? When you say Trinity is a paradox at the level of a representation, then Trinity is a contradiction. So let's take this big picture, you know, of a paradoxical condition helping the propagation and the transmission of paradoxical representation or interaction. Then my question would be, what is not paradoxical in the model? Is it possible that paradoxical representation or interaction can be conditioned by non-paradoxical conditions, or other reverse? Our paradoxical condition can favors non-paradoxical, the propagation of non-paradoxical representation or interactions. I just want to see the negative of your model and what you cannot put inside your model, and what are the limits basically of your explanatory models.
I think there's a risk of circularity, of a circular bias. I think mostly that paradoxical experience is the production of two different elements. For example, thoughts. Let's stay in the level of thoughts. Two thoughts that can be held together. And so the person experience that has to find another framework to integrate them. Try to think to cold and hot at the same time. Or if you have a representation of something which is both at the same time, or you create this representation, or you can synthesize, and so you can stay with both together. And so basically paradox is a condition, an unstable condition, which leads to the emergence of a different framework. This framework can be paradoxical or not.
Can you have example of non-paradoxical second level?
For example,
maybe it's too late.
let's say God. We can melt the notion of existence, and we can have both the notion of presence and absence at the same time of God. But when the notion of God is built, it can be associated with a non-paradoxical representation. Is to say, the sense of the emerged item is paradoxical because it comes from a paradoxical experience, existence, non-existence, but then it can be associated with absolutely non-paradoxical representations like the image of Jesus, or anthropomorphizing the deity. And so.
I feel that there are like cases of paradoxical experiences that you have mentioned is in a sense similar to some pathological cases like depersonalization syndrome or total syndrome, in which the patient like make a report of their experiences in such a way that they seem not to exist, or they seem to be dead, or so on. But if he is really dead, he cannot make a report or something like that. In that sense, the experiences of such patients seem to be very paradoxical in phenomenology. So I want to know if you have some idea of such pathological cases in relation to the cases that you have mentioned. Do you have some relationship or similarity or whatever?
But I can come back to the example of the spiritual being, which is a being which does not exist, but if a person is weak and tends to believe in it, then it becomes real. And so this is this kind of paradox. For example, in schizophrenia, This is the case of inserted thoughts. Some thoughts that are in the subjective space of the persons and are perceived as internal, but flashed from the outside. For example, think to the studies of Chris Firth about people saying these things are flashed on my memory by an external person. In this case, you experience something that is yours, but it is not yours. And so in schizophrenia, I think the difference is that in schizophrenia, the person has not the metacognitive ability to create different framework for different situations, and so the risk is to collapse into a whole confusion.
And the difference consists in whether or not they can make different frameworks. That's the difference between pathological cases and the cases that you have mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Right, okay, thank you.
You know, just go on the right of the time first. Well, mine is very short. Or maybe yours as well. Is that you mentioned, you know, these paradoxes as way to basically elicit other approaches, even related to meditation. And I think that for me at least, Zen Buddhism was, at least not these days, but was basically all about getting into, you know, using paradoxes to focus, to meditate deeply on paradoxes, basically enter, so to say, this enlightenment or getting insights. Are you interested in like Zen Buddhism, or how do you think it fits into this?
Of course, I'm interested in all non-dualistic traditions because, for example, in Vedanta, some paradoxical representations in Vedanta are the same because through tantric tradition can be found in Vedantic tradition, in Dzogchen, for example, a lot in Dzogchen, in Hatha Yoga, and then it arrives to Buddhist tradition, just to Zen. It's of course it's a long thread. I just chosen one tradition, but of course that's the same macro tradition.
If we have time, I have a question about the meditative trance, because I know that the word trance is quite hard to define. Also, I remember I read actually it's a book from the Artemog, maybe in 2009 or something, that people of the association were trying to define trance, and I think we have also some difficulties with meditation. And so what will be meditative trance?
But in this case, I will be very pragmatic. Meditative because it is connected to explicit meditative traditions. So with some techniques, what?
You mean because it's the same with meditation, you know, like maybe 20 years ago here, let's say in France, we didn't really use so much this word meditation, and especially it was maybe more like in a Buddhist context. If you were going in a practice of Qigong, the word meditation was not so widely used. And now you mentioned the work of the mind and life, and Oussama talk about also the all mindfulness and whatnot. Now meditation is also a trend.
Mm-hmm.
So is meditation is a name that we apply to a practice, or is it an act too?
There's a problem of the notion. In this kind, what is relevant for this project is to stay at the level of the common actual notion of meditation and all the practices which are associated too in these traditions. But of course, if you have to define the notion from a phenomenological point of view, what is meditation? It's another problem, and I think that even what is called meditation in one single Ramakrishna ashram is an archipelago, a sort of constellation of practices and connected states. It is, of course, to recognize.
Okay, so I guess we had a great day, I guess, all of us. Like we always wait now.
Yeah, 10 a.m. here. 9 Thank you. Yes.